Michael glanced at the bottom right corner of the notebook where the date and time were located. He caught himself when he saw that he was catastrophically late. Michael hastily got up from his desk, but immediately sat back down in his leather chair with a loud exhale. He covered his eyes, trying to cope with the sudden dizziness and the darkness before him. Michael nodded unhappily to himself. Lately, he had been catching himself more and more often with his well-being problems. The young man was bothered by a fatigue that was building up and building up. He began to be tormented by attacks of shortness of breath, appearing even after a small, it would seem, load. For example, if earlier he easily ran to the 5th floor of the office, ignoring the elevator, now such a march up the stairs was given to him much worse. His condition began to notice acquaintances, colleagues, and of course relatives. Michael walked frighteningly pale, tired, not himself, like a ghost, except that the chains did not rattle. However, to the doctor he was not in a hurry, because he diagnosed himself workaholism. Yes, the man worked hard. He could skip meals without feeling hungry because of the business and continuous work process. He practically never took a day off. Michael also slept very little. He knew perfectly well that 8 hours is the recommended norm of healthy sleep. However, he was inspired by the stories of successful people of the past who slept much less, but were able to achieve greatness. For example, the Roman politician and military leader Gaius Julius Caesar, who founded the great Roman Empire, slept only 3 hours a night. Would he have achieved this result if he had slept 8 hours? Michael thought. I don't think so. Leonardo da Vinci, if historians are to be believed, a brilliant artist and inventor, slept a total of 2 hours a night, working the other 22 hours. And Napoleon was not far behind. He slept 4 hours and claimed that only sick people slept 9 hours a night. Michael did not consider himself a sick person. He wanted to be among the geniuses. Then his mode was anxiously pointed out by concerned people, hinting that the man is not Julius Caesar and exactly so will drive himself into the coffin. He only joked in his own manner, waving his hand. I'll rest in the other world, Michael smiled carefree. There is no time for sleep when great things await us. Except that at that moment the man had not even imagined how close he would be to the other world at this rate of work. Now Michael sat in his office, unable to get up and go to a business meeting. I guess I should sleep sometimes, he grumbled aloud, still hesitant to raise his eyelids. He touched his temples with cool fingers, hoping to give himself some relief. It bothered him, the condition of being able to go to work even in times of ill health or illness. There was a simple explanation. Michael had inherited his father's company not too long ago. He wanted to justify the trust of his parent, who had put his heart, strength, and health not only into raising a decent heir, but also into the enterprise. His dad, Scott, was the founder and owner of Farm and Garment Company, which owned a number of popular clothing brands. But that's now a thriving business. Before, their family had nothing. The family's success story could be a role model and an inspiration for business endeavors for today's entrepreneurs. Scott came from a simple family. His father worked as a mechanic and his mother was a cook in the school cafeteria. When Scott was 10 years old, the family experienced grief. They lost his father. The man's heart couldn't take it, so began a new, difficult period of their lives. Money was scarce. The boy could not watch his mother labor alone. He was brought up to be a man who should be a support. So he started working part-time at the age of 12. He delivered newspapers to mailboxes, offered to wash cars, carried boxes of vegetables in stalls. In general, did not bend any work. When Scott went to the 8th grade, he was lucky enough to get a job in a clothing store, where clothes were sewn for rich customers. Basically, the teenager was engaged in what ran messenger on various errands. However, the work attracted him. After 2 years, he decided to try himself as an apprentice to a fashion designer. He avidly absorbed the experience of craftsmanship, as well as observed the structure of the business from the inside. It was during that period that the idea of a future business was born in the soul of a young boy. However, the main motivation in his career was love. Scott met Jessica when he turned 18 years old. It was Jessica who became the person who supported all his ideas in word and deed. They got married at the age of 20. It was only a year after the wedding when they decided to open their own knitting factory. Admittedly, the business was family-owned, very small. At first, Scott and his mom and his wife sewed their own custom-made clothes and linens in their own living room. It was difficult and inconvenient, but the result was worth it. The next push on the road to success was a bump in the road. Their partner turned out to be dishonest, and at the last moment refused to buy out a large batch of already sewn clothes. Then the couple, having consulted, decided to sell the goods themselves. To this end, they opened their first small store. To their amazement, the goods in the store were sold out as quickly as fresh hotcakes at the local market. Later, one store became a chain, and then the brand grew into a corporation. Knowing the history of the brand, Scott's son Michael, at the helm, simply could not let this ship with branded clothes wreck. Michael realized from childhood that he would be the heir to the company, but that was not his burden. He loved the brainchild of his parents with all his soul. As a high school student, Michael helped his father keep up with the times by taking the brand online. Later, they took the brand to the overseas market. Unfortunately, the market was now flooded with new clothing brands that appeared like mushrooms after rain. There were a lot of competitors and no time to rest, so Michael worked hard to improve the company. For example, he now wanted to offer customers clothes made of eco-friendly materials in a natural style. For this, he planned to use organic cotton. He believed that the eco-friendly trend would help the firm reach greater heights. Only Michael did not know that instead of a business meeting, he would end up in a doctor's office. Michael didn't immediately open his eyes, feeling as if his eyelids were filled with lead. The dull ache in his head was growing, and something was stirring in his chest. The man opened the top drawer of his desk, where a cardboard packet of painkillers lay. When he pulled it out, however, he found it glistening, already emptied. "That's great. That's just great," Michael grumbled, tossing the packet into the paper garbage can. Having no better alternative, he picked up the half-empty water bottle and took a couple of sips. Relief didn't come, but there was no choice. Time was running out, making the punctual businessman even more nervous. Gathering his strength, the man got up from his chair. Picking up the necessary papers, Michael headed for the exit from the office. But he didn't have time to touch the door handle. The world in front of him was spinning, and rapidly plunging his consciousness into chaos. Michael did not even realize what was happening to him, as he collapsed to the floor unconscious. When he lifted his eyelids, a bright light hit his eyes, and the unpleasant odor of alcohol and sterility immediately entered his nostrils. His left arm ached, and the back of his head hurt too. The discomfort made Michael groan, drawing the attention of the young woman who sat next to his bed. It was his fiancée, Jessica. "Honey, are awake? God, I was so worried. Wait. I'll get the doctor," the spectacular blonde whirled around. She rushed toward Michael at first, but then darted the other way toward the exit. Michael didn't have the strength to stop her and demand an explanation. Within a couple of minutes, a nurse and a doctor entered the room. "Michael, glad to have you back with us," the doctor smiled. "My name is Frank. How are you feeling?" "Michael is fine," he said, confused. "I feel at sea in my eyebrows, and I don't understand what happened. How did I even end up in a hospital bed?" "Your secretary found you on the floor of your office," Jessica cut in. "Hello." She called an ambulance, then called me. "You passed out." "Must have been sleep deprivation," the man said, embarrassed. Except the doctor shook his head. "Unfortunately, the causes of your condition are much more serious," he informed. "I don't want to jump to conclusions or scare you, but my prognosis is not favorable. I'll be able to tell you more precisely when we've made the necessary examinations." "I don't have time for that," Michael began. Except the doctor interrupted him. "No one has time for doctors," Frank frowned. "Just when do you find it? Sometimes it's too late. I insist on hospitalization and a full examination." Michael looked up at the doctor. He thought of telling him not to make a big deal out of it. Well, he fainted. It's not a big deal. Only when he met the doctor's gaze, Michael felt his seriousness. The doctor was not joking. He was concerned about the patient's condition, his anxiety, albeit a little, but transferred to Michael. And the parents, when they learned of their son's condition, not on a joke alarmed. So Michael was forced to postpone deals and contracts to deal with his own health. Since that day, everything was wrapped up. A string of medical offices, examinations, procedures, tests. The cardiologist appointed a lot of studies. As a result, it was found that Michael has the most severe pathology of myocardium. At the same time, the disease was rapidly progressing. After another examination, the doctor came to a verdict. You have cardiomyopathy. It's a dangerous pathology that can be fatal. How did Michael feel when he heard his diagnosis? Nothing. He just didn't believe it. It has to be. There must be some mistake, the man said calmly. The heart disease is fatal. Really? It's not like I'm an old man, some doctor. Michael smiled. He wasn't mad at the doctor. Sure, doctors are human too, they make mistakes. But Michael couldn't be terminally ill. That doesn't make any sense. He's young. He's got his whole life ahead of him. The kid had just inherited his father's company. The new business owner had tons of ideas, energy, and of course, health. He used to. More recently, he'd been hitting the pool and the gym, so he always stayed in shape. Yes, perhaps, could not abuse coffee and had a bad habit smoking. But who doesn't sin these days? Except that the doctor looked at the man with pity. like a drowning man, grasping at straws. "Unfortunately, there is no mistake," he said. "We don't make such diagnoses unless we're absolutely certain, Michael." The doctor explained calmly and firmly. "Okay," Michael nodded hesitantly, "but it's treatable. We live in the 21st century. We will soon have robots working instead of people. Surely there are some therapies in Israel, Germany. I have enough money for any kind of treatment." "Unfortunately, drug treatment will no longer be effective," said the doctor categorically. "Your condition is steadily worsening. Only a heart transplant will help you." In Michael's mind, his words sounded like a judge's gavel hitting the stand. They were the verdict, not the diagnosis. A donor heart, a stranger's heart, that was going to save his life. That's what frightened Michael. He rubbed his face with the palms of his hands with effort, trying to come to his senses. His head ached again, this time from the heavy thoughts that filled it like bees buzzing in a hive. But how? Why? How could this have happened? Michael was astonished. "I've always led a healthy lifestyle. All right, I admit it. I smoke. I can have a drink. I have fun on the weekends. Nothing criminal. I've been a friend of sports since I was a kid. Never had any restrictions from doctors. Couldn't you see that before? All situations and people are individual. Unfortunately," the doctor explained, "heart diseases are getting younger every year. Therefore, even young, healthy people like you are not immune to such ailments. In your case, the cause may be heredity. Your grandfather died of the same disease at a relatively young age." "But I didn't feel any problems before," Michael said indignantly. "It had only recently started." "Some diseases are called silent killers," the doctor explained patiently. "They don't make themselves known until it's too late. Your disease may have been lurking, but now it's progressing. It could have been triggered by an infection. Your mom said you were sick recently, but you kept working. By the way, your habit of being sick on your feet and working hard has also contributed to your health. You'll have to change your lifestyle, eliminate exercise, stress, and diet." Michael shook his head, trying to come to terms with the new reality. At this second, he acutely realized that money is just papers, because having a bank account did not save the man from a terrible diagnosis, and even dependence on the mercy of fate. After all, buying a heart is not like going to the market to buy vegetables. "How long will I wait for a donor heart, doctor?" Michael was confused. "Gradually, I realized that there is not much time left for the motor in his chest. Is there really no other way out? Either a transplant or a miracle will help you." The doctor spread his hands. "But I'm not a magician. I'm a cardiac surgeon, so I'll help as much as I can." Michael was put on the waiting list, which stretched for many months. It seems like 10 months in a person's life is a drop in the bucket. Not when there's a bomb in your chest, ready to cut your life short at any moment. Every day, Michael lived in hope that today he would receive a phone call saying that they had found a donor organ. After all, he was absolutely not ready to say goodbye to life. Jessica, however, insisted on speeding up the process and simply buying the organ through a transplant clinic. "We have the money, Michael," she said, her plump lips tightening. "Why are you standing in line like you don't have any?" Michael shrugged. Yes, there was money. He had, admittedly, been inquiring about buying an organ himself. It turned out that the modern world was such that everything was bought and sold. Even when it came to a human heart, this issue was regulated by law. There were a lot of pitfalls, but to buy a heart was real. Only Michael couldn't. Something inside him resisted. It told him to wait in line humbly and patiently, to live in hope just as others do. Buy a donor heart. Buy someone's life, he echoed his fiancée's question. It even sounds kind of wild. Blood donor, okay? Bone marrow, okay. But a heart. There's no real volunteers to give a heart, right? Do you need it yourself? I don't understand, Jessica said, looking at Michael confused. Why are you saying this? I'm saying that my hope for survival is a kind of sin. I mean, if I want to survive, I have to hope that someone dies. Someone dies in an accident or a coma or something, leaves me their heart, and then they're gone, leaving their loved ones, their parents, their children. Jessica pressed her beautiful lips together again, looking completely displeased. You won't even recognize the man's name. What do you care? That bothers me, too, Michael said thoughtfully, that I won't know the name of the man who saved my life. And so the days passed. They stretched slowly, like gum stuck to the bottom of a shoe. Mother was the hardest of all. She couldn't contain her emotions. Every time she saw her son, she tried to smile, to be happy. But then she said goodbye to her child, as if for the last time, and began to cry, holding her son to her chest. But everything will be all right, Michael smiled, stroking his mother's trembling shoulders. He truly believed what he was saying. Thursday was extremely rainy. It had been raining all week, turning the streets into a parody of the canals of Venice, except that it wasn't gondolas but cars splashing water all around them. Michael received a call on his phone that divided his life into a before and after. Michael was informed that a suitable organ donor had been found. Happiness swept over the entire family. However, excitement was felt more. Michael himself was not worried. He was sure that everything would go well, and he had nothing to lose. His premonition did not let him down. The operation lasted 8 hours and went without complications. The man woke up with a new heart, and it was working properly in his chest. The organ was absolutely healthy and full of vigor. The days after the surgery were hard. Michael felt as if he had fallen back into childhood, that helpless state that babies are in. He even jokingly called himself Benjamin Button, a character from his favorite movie. Michael was like an adult and a child at the same time. It was like he was learning to live again. Some time after the transplant, Michael was allowed to watch TV and read a little. He was discharged about a month later. Then he was in home rehabilitation for another month. Every day Michael's condition was getting better, and soon the disease and the fear of dying seemed something distant, as if from another life. However, he was really starting a new life, because a new heart was beating in his chest. 3 months had passed since the operation. Michael felt great. The only thing that worried him was the name of his savior. Thinking about it did not give rest, tormented his soul as much as the disease before that tormented his heart. His condition was noticed by his best friend Brian. He paid another visit to his comrade. "You look sad, Mike, I get it. You're unhappy that we're not meeting for a glass of good whiskey as usual and drinking freshly squeezed juice." And on a Friday night, the man grinned and lifted the glass of bright orange liquid. "Trust me, buddy, I'm not thrilled with what I'm drinking either," Michael replied with a grin. "By the way, it's pumpkin and carrots, I think. You're lucky. They used to make me drink beet juice. It's good for your blood vessels." Brian shook his head sympathetically. "No, seriously. What's the matter with you? Are you worried about the company?" my friend asked. "Casper and Jessica are doing okay, aren't they?" Michael sighed. "Yeah, about the company. That's what I'm worrying about." He's not used to delegating his responsibilities. His deputy Casper and fiancée Jessica were now handling the business. He wasn't even allowed to get involved in business so he wouldn't get nervous and avoid stress. Only that wasn't what Michael was worried about. "You know, I decided from the very first day I had a heart transplant that I wanted to learn about the donor's family. Not just find out, but go to them. Thank them. Tell them how grateful I am for the chance their relative gave me. Maybe help financially, I don't know," my friend asked thoughtfully. "Do you think that's a good idea? Not everyone will be happy if a man comes to them and says, 'Bring me to the organ of your husband, brother, son.' There's a reason they keep everything secret," Brian objected. "You're right." I guess Michael nodded, looking at his own glass of juice, which he hadn't touched yet. "But what if they need help? They've lost a loved one, possibly the breadwinner." "Okay, but how do you know the name of the donor?" "As far as I know, doctors aren't authorized to release that information. It's confidential. It's against the law. I heard somewhere that it's possible to get the donor's name. A year." "You're right again. But I want to at least try to find them right now, especially since you can find out anything you want for money. You know, I feel like I have to find them. Do I have to? It's like my heart is begging me and leading me. I wake up at night and I feel it beating and tearing. Man, it sounds stupid, doesn't it? It's like I'm a character in some soap opera." Brian was thoughtful and shook his head. "You know, when you got sick, I got interested in this whole heart transplant thing. Well, I found out that Rockefeller bought himself 5 or 6 hearts, lived over 100 years as a result. I've heard that," nodded Michael, who had a passion for reading biographies of famous people. "What about it?" "Nothing. It's not about him. I just read about people adopting the habits of their donors." He sipped his juice with gusto, continued. "Suddenly, for example, one woman who before the operation did not drink alcohol and did not like fast food. After the transplant, she wanted a can of beer and chicken and loved the donor's musical tastes. At first, she liked classical music, and then she liked rap music. Turns out the donor was a college boyfriend who had crashed his motorcycle. He liked beer, listened to rap, and loved fried chicken and batter. There are many, many cases like this. One worker who got a violinist's heart loved classical music, and the guy who got a drowning man's heart transplant was terrified of bodies of water. And you're saying that my new heart also requires meeting the donor's loved ones?" His friend Brian understood correctly, smiling. "But it's not much what your heart wants. There was a case where a man married the donor's widow because his heart loved her." Michael woke up laughing. You know, I used to remind myself of a character in a melodrama or a Brazilian soap opera. But you beat me to it. He poked his friend in the shoulder with his fist. Don't tell me that my heart loves someone else. She's a rival. She'll find me before I do and eliminate me. Oh, you Brian waved his hand angrily, then took a generous sip of juice and grimaced at the taste. I'm trying to be supportive. By the way, though Michael chuckled, he listened to his friend's theory. He didn't give up on his idea. Finding the information he needed about the donor wasn't that hard, but it didn't come cheap. After all, Michael had the donor's name. His name was Patrick. When Michael received the letter with the information, his heart jumped in his chest, beating faster. It turned out that his savior was a young man the same age as Michael. He'd been in a car accident on one of those rainy days when the roads were slippery. His heart was a perfect match for Michael, so perfect that even the doctors were shocked. The man's voice trembled with overwhelming emotion. I'm sorry, Patrick, that you died, but thank you anyway, Michael said aloud then. I promise I'll live my life for two. Unfortunately, finding a name was not enough. Finding the donor's relatives turned out to be a whole quest. Michael had to hire a private investigator to find out that the boy was from an orphanage. He had no parents or other relatives. The apartment was state-owned. It went to the state after the young man's death. But Michael found out that his donor was going to get married, but the wedding did not take place. The groom died a month before the important event, which made the situation even more tragic. Then the guy decided to find out the bride's address. Michael felt he needed to talk to someone. He was too far gone to stop. That's how he found out that the bride's name was Audrey Fomina. That's where Michael headed. The navigator led him to a village, and from there kind people showed him the way. It turned out that the house of the donor's fiancée was located in a Dhaka community on its outskirts. The dilapidated building was located on a plot of land near a dense forest. Getting out of the car, Michael was confused and even embarrassed. He pulled out his smartphone to check the address again. There were no signs on the house, but the map said it was in the right place. The house looked completely abandoned. A patch of tall grass surrounded it. The gate of the low fence was open, and in some places it had fallen down. Michael decided to follow the overgrown path to the house, but no sooner had he reached the front door than it swung open. A young woman, in tears, jumped out. She was followed by the man's threatening, drunken shout, "Get out of here. Someone's wife was thinking of pouring out moonshine. We live on it." Fool. The girl, whose eyes were full of tears, did not notice Michael and ran at him with a swing. Oh, she was frightened, looking up at the unexpected guest. "I'm sorry," please, Michael said, confused. But the girl shook her head, wiping away her tears. "It's okay." The girl was very beautiful. Despite her disheveled hair and tears on her cheeks, her green eyes were framed by curved lashes. Her eyebrows were dark, slightly covered by her bangs. Her hair was black, like thick tar, lips plump and sensual. Jessica, Michael's fiancée, had those lips as a result of surgery. The stranger's lips were clearly her own, as were the smooth, thin nose and cheekbones. Michael found himself staring at her. She had charmed him at first sight. His heart froze in his chest, skipping a beat. Then it beat fast and fast, picking up the pace again, as if recognizing the brunette. Michael put his palm to his chest, seriously afraid for his heart. He didn't need such worries, and the nature of them was unclear. The girl is beautiful and crying. Any man would want to protect her, to feel like a knight. However, Michael realized that this was not the main cause of concern. The girl, unaware of Michael's confusion, wiped away her tears with her sleeve before looking at the stranger. However, as soon as her eyes focused on the brunette's face, she became numb. Her face instantly lost its colors from sobbing and running, becoming as pale as a canvas. "My God," whispered the girl, grabbing the cross that dangled on her chest. "Oh my God, this can't be happening." She took a step backward on unsteady, shaky legs. Then, as if she changed her mind, she moved toward Michael again. A slender, graceful hand slid its fingers along the silver chain and reached for the brunette's face in indecision. The next moment, her thick lashes fluttered like butterfly wings. Her beautiful eyes closed, and her body slid smoothly, as if in slow motion, to the floor. Michael, not realizing what was happening, picked the girl up in his arms. "Oh, what's the matter with you?" he asked, frightened, but consciousness had already left the stranger. Hearing strangers talking from the house, an elderly man came out on the porch. He was holding in his hand a bottle of beer, almost finished, which he had touched when he went out for air. "And you," he shouted, waking up, "what do you think you're doing? What did Herod do to you?" Michael understood how the situation looked from the outside. However, he could not give a clear answer as to why he was holding the unconscious girl in his arms. and he doubted that this drunken man would be able to understand his words. "This is not the kind of meeting I expected at my donor's house," Michael said mentally. In fact, I didn't know what to expect. He took the girl in his arms. He noticed with amazement that Audrey, as the brunette was called, was as light as a feather. She fainted, he informed the owner of the house, unwittingly excusing himself. "I didn't do anything. Show me where I can put her. We need to call an ambulance." The man clucked his tongue in frustration, but stepped aside. "Take her into the room." "There's a couch," shouted the man. "Fucking witch." It was only when Michael had carried out the order, placing the frail girl with the greatest care on the old red sofa, that he turned to the old man. He frowned, his eyebrows drawn together at the bridge of his nose in a myopic stare, and then recoiled from Michael as if he were a ghost. His gait, shaky from the alcohol, became even more unsteady. Michael watched in bewilderment as the second man in the last 5 minutes began to shake at the sight of him, like a leaf in the wind. The bottle fell out of the older man's hands, its contents spilling onto the old carpet. Dibs on me. Here's to it," wailed the man with superstitious consternation, looking at Michael. "You've come for me. For what?" "For me." The master of the house shook his teeth. They clattered, giving out a drumbeat. He paused in his words. "Holy, holy, holy," muttered the man, raising his hand threateningly and crossing himself. "Why have you come back? Why have you come back? Do you think I'm hurting her? No, I'm not. It's just that we need the money. I took care of her. I didn't neglect her. And your baby, too. I swear, Patrick." Michael shook his head. "The geezer's on a hot streak." "Belina, are you drunk, old man?" he whispered dazedly, adding louder, "Pull yourself together. Please give me a normal house address so I can call a doctor." He tried to calm the man down while pulling out his cell phone to summon help for the girl, but he never got a response from the owner of the house. At some point, he threw himself on his knees and began to recite either Our Father or some other prayer. Michael didn't understand. "It was crazy," he commented. This whole situation was getting out of hand. Michael was already dialing an ambulance number to call the paramedics, at least to explain the way. He realized that doctors were needed here. Psychiatrists, too, it seemed. But no sooner had he pressed the call button than the springs on the couch creaked. First briefly and then long. A barely audible moan came from the girl. Michael turned to her and immediately ran back to the couch. He felt a new wave of anxiety for the strange brunette. "Are you okay?" he asked, realizing that she had come to her senses. The girl blinked rapidly, as if getting used to the artificial light of the room. Then she focused her gaze on the face of Michael looming over her. Her lips trembled finely. She slowly raised a graceful hand and held it out to Michael's face. He watched mesmerized as the stranger's fingers touched his cheek. At first, she barely touched the man's skin with her fingertips and pulled her hand away as if she'd been burned. Her gaze became intense. There was a crease between her eyebrows and eyeline. The brunette only repeated the attempt to touch. This time she was bolder. Her hand rested on Michael's cheek, sliding over it with the utmost tenderness. She stroked his cheek with her thumb, and the touch was so pleasant that Michael could hardly keep from covering his eyes and moving toward her palm, like a cat nuzzling its owner. He stirred, pulling himself together. Madness must be contagious. I got some kind of airborne disease from these strange people, Michael said mentally. I can't believe it, the girl whispered. Tears came to her eyes again. They glistened like 2 gems, but she blinked and they fell from her lashes. The girl's tears slid down to her chin, leaving wet traces on her delicate skin. Michael gently touched her palm, moving it away from her face. However, when he tried to take his hand away from the stranger's fingers, the stranger prevented him from doing so. She clung to it, squeezing his hand with insistent softness. You have me confused with someone else, Michael said quietly, worried about the girl and her condition. Let me get you a doctor. All right, you'll get help. The girl frowned, drawing her straight eyebrows together. She shook her head stubbornly. She stared into the face of the man frozen in front of her. No, but how is that possible? Whispered the brunette, barely audible. You look too much like you. Like Patrick, the same face. Hearing the familiar name, Michael nodded. Yes, Patrick. I came here because of him. Patrick Akamov, he said. Say your name is Audrey Fulmina, right? The girl's hand twitched. She jumped up sharply on the couch, assuming a sitting position. Yes, she nodded hesitantly. Patrick didn't tell me about you. That's why I was so shocked. I thought he had no relatives, no one. He was from the orphanage. Michael sighed, shaking his head. No, I'm not related to him. He froze in indecision. He thought that now was not the best time to admit that the heart of this woman's fiancé was beating in his chest. She seemed a little crazy to him. The brunette's eyebrows crept upward. Her gaze hid behind her bangs like a screen. Her face stretched and a hesitant smile appeared on her lips. "Are you sure?" she asked, as if it were Michael, not her, who was acting like an escaped mental patient. Then the girl pulled out her cell phone. Opening the gallery, she found the picture and held it out to Michael. "Can there be such coincidences?" she asked, still looking at the man with disbelief. Michael picked up the other man's smartphone and peered into the screen. He was stunned to see a picture of himself. It was his face, but there was someone else in the picture. That someone was hugging Audrey around the waist and smiling broadly. Her dark hair was disheveled. What Michael didn't let himself do, comb it back all the time. His brown eyes were laughing. From behind the guy's back looked out the fingerboard of a guitar in a black case. Without asking for permission, Michael began flipping through the pictures on the other man's phone. There were many pictures of the man with his face on it. "How is that possible?" Michael muttered, feeling close to insanity himself. He pulled the collar of his shirt away from his throat, trying to swallow the lump. Sweat broke out on his forehead and temples. "I thought you were Patrick," the girl admitted quietly, keeping her eyes on him. She pulled her knees up to her and wrapped her arms around them. Now her behavior did not seem strange to Michael. On the contrary, she got over the shock quite quickly, considering the situation. What would he do if he saw a dead relative or loved one quite awake and alive, running off to visit? Surely fainting would have been less likely. What could have happened? "I don't know what's going on," Michael said, pulling his eyes away from the photo and looking at Audrey. "I'll try to figure it out. Just tell me now, is everything all right?" The girl didn't have time to answer. The next second, Michael saw her eyes open wide with horror. She opened her mouth, screaming loudly and anxiously somewhere behind his back. "No, don't. Stop." Michael wanted to turn around to see what was the danger, what had frightened Audrey so much, but he didn't have time. The next moment, something heavy came down on his head. The man felt a sharp, dull pain, and then everything in front of his eyes began to darken. He could still see Audrey's face as she slowly cried. Then it was pitch black. When Michael opened his eyes, he groaned, not from pain or discomfort, but from frustration. "Am I back in the hospital?" he muttered, looking at the walls of the room. "This is getting to be a bad habit. I'll have to get myself a private room, since I'm a regular guest here." He got up from the bed, feeling the bandages on his head, and touched the bandages with his fingers, but it didn't hurt. Michael remembered being in the strange house, and then he felt the impact. He remembered the old man, too. Surely that old Pinchuk had decided not to wait for the help of God, to whom he desperately called to deal with the evil in his own way. If the ghoul came out of the grave, he should organize a trip back. Michael didn't even know whether to condemn the strange old man. After all, he too had met a ghost, although he would have preferred to be doused with holy water or salt, pelted. To begin with, they immediately began pummeling him with a club or whatever it was that hit him. The answer to the question of where the wound on the back of his head came 10 minutes later. A nurse looked into the room, and noticing that the patient had regained consciousness, called the doctor. "You were hit on the head with a bottle," he explained. "It's a good thing it was empty, and not a bat, so you got away with bruises and a mild concussion. But given your personality, such an emotional upheaval can take a toll on your health. I want to support you in the hospital and monitor your condition." Michael only sighed heavily. He did not argue with the doctor. "What happened to the girl Audrey and that man?" he asked the doctor. "The girl called an ambulance. They sent the man to the station. I don't know what happened next," the doctor replied. "They are probably waiting for you to testify." The police did come to the room, demanding from Michael an explanation. However, the guy did not press charges against the drunken old man. He decided that he would first deal with everything that had happened himself. The next few days, Michael was lost in conjecture, trying to understand why his donor looked like a twin brother or a clone. It wasn't until he got out of the hospital that he was able to unravel the mystery. Michael arrived at his parents' house as he didn't want to ask such strange questions over the phone. Upon hearing his story, they looked at each other. Michael's mom looked at her son with fright, reached out her hands and squeezed his fingers. "We have something important to tell you," the woman began. "I had hoped we would never bring it up again. But fate had decided otherwise." Michael frowned as he looked at his parents. He was ready to hear that he had a twin brother, but his parents' story came as a shock. "I don't know who that man was," Mom said. Addressing him as Patrick, however, "I can't claim that you don't have a brother." "What do you mean?" Michael asked. "I don't understand." Mom squeezed his fingers tighter, looked away, looked toward her husband's face for support and the right words. Scott, however, sat stone-faced and expressionless. It seemed that the man had gone deep into his thoughts and was not with them now. "Remember when you needed a blood donor? No one from our family came up," the woman asked softly, and, after waiting for her son's nod, continued. "The thing is, we're not related to you by blood, Michael. But before I tell you everything, I want you to know, I've always thought of you as my son, my own, my favorite, my only son. There's never been a second that I thought otherwise. In fact, Michael, I thought you were sent from above. You were our salvation and our gift. Do you understand?" No, Michael didn't understand. He really didn't understand anything his mother was saying. He saw her face, decorated with a web of wrinkles, which did not spoil the appearance of this noble woman, filled with sadness. He saw the tears glistening in her light blue eyes, ready to burst out. "But didn't you say that my illness is an inheritance from my grandfather?" he asked. "The doctor said it could be one of the causes, but that's just a coincidence, sweetheart," his mother explained gently. "Go on, please." "Okay," he asked, feeling his throat tighten with excitement. He was thirsty, but he dared not take his palm from his mother's hand. "When your father and I met, we were young. I got pregnant almost as soon as we met. Of course, keeping the baby was out of the question. We had nothing. We ate empty pasta, we didn't even have butter. Though we took care of his mom, she was very ill at times. We lived in an old apartment, worked in it. All we had was a dream in youth." Scott was taking the first steps towards the success he so desired. However, when I admitted that I was expecting a child, he decided not to chase a phantom dream, but to stay. He said he'd get married, take care of me and the baby. I mentioned that he would get a regular job with a stable schedule. Started looking for a place. Only I could see how longingly he looked at the things we were going to create. That's when I decided I wasn't ready to do that to the man I loved, and our destiny not ready to take away what Scott breathed, and not ready to stop, barely a mother. "Did you get rid of the baby?" Michael asked bluntly, seeing that his mother was having trouble finishing the story out loud. He figured out that he himself had been born when his parents were in their 30s, so he couldn't have been that child, but neither could Patrick, so there were still questions. His mother nodded, corrected a strand of gray hair poking out from behind her ear, and lowered her palm to her son's fingers again. This decision, however, was fatal. There was no money for abortion in good clinics. I won't mention the details, I was barely saved at that time. Since then, the health problems began, admitted his mother, looking at the floor. When we got married, then we were successful and seemed to have forgotten about that incident. We started thinking about the baby again. Now we could give our baby boy everything. He would be long awaited and live a life of wealth and love. I reassured myself, saying that I had done everything right. But after that incident, I couldn't get pregnant for a long time. When we were completely desperate, I finally saw the cherished 2 stripes on the test. The woman smiled sadly, wistfully. She looked toward the kitchen sink, except that she saw no faucet, no sponge, no cup of morning coffee in front of her. She was looking deep into her past. The happiness didn't last long. I had a miscarriage. Then there were 2 more attempts, both ending the same way. The 3rd miscarriage was especially hard. The term was already long enough. I thought I was going to go crazy. I thought it was my punishment. The psychologist said I was making things worse for myself. I don't let myself bear a child in peace, because I am tormented by remorse and guilt because of the first baby I didn't let come into the world. Doctors said it was a complication of a failed abortion. Whatever the reason, the fact remained. We couldn't have children. "So you decided to take a baby from the orphanage," Michael guessed, trying to put the puzzle together on his own. "You took me, not knowing that I had a brother. Maybe we were separated." The mother shook her head, surprising her son. "We didn't adopt you from the orphanage, Michael. I told you that I truly believed you were sent to me from above as an attempt at redemption. At one point, I even believed you were my unborn son. It was silly and ridiculous. But at that time in my life, I was in such an abyss of despair that the thought saved me." The mother was silent for a while, bringing the memories back in order to share them. Michael was silent this time, too, finally confused and wanting to just know the truth. "As I said, my 3rd miscarriage was late term. Before that, I had been going to church constantly, praying for forgiveness, praying to carry at least 1 child. One winter day, when I came to church, it was already dusk. As soon as I entered the church, I was terrified. A shadow passed from the side of me and rushed toward the gate of the church. It was a strange woman, poorly dressed. She pushed my shoulder to the side, hiding her face, and squeezed her way to the exit. The stranger clutched something to her chest and ran away without looking back. I looked over to where she was running from. There were Christmas decorations left behind the fence. People were bringing cookies, candy, fruit, leaving donations. I figured it was a poor woman who wanted to take something for herself. She was probably hungry, but I didn't pay much attention to it. Went up to the church, put out candles, then headed toward the parking lot behind the church fence. It was very cold outside. The frost was getting worse. There wasn't a soul around. And then I heard a strange sound. I was frightened. It was dark, but out of curiosity I decided to approach the source of the noise. My mother frowned, remembering that moment. I couldn't see anything at first. It was dark. There was white snow piled up all around, making the view a bit cloudy. I felt sick to my stomach, and my lower abdomen was starting to ache. I looked at the figures they had put up for the parishioners in honor of Christmas. It was the famous scene in the stable when Jesus was born. Hannah and Sean were bent over a small baby. A donkey, a sheep, and a cow were sprawled around. I looked at Hannah, remembering the woman who cleaned the place. I felt sorry for her and for all the people who come to the church hoping for help. I pulled a few bills out of my wallet and decided to put them in with the other donations. Only when I bent down did I gasp in fright. There was something swarming in there. Glancing at the nursery, the pet feeder, I stumbled over. There was a real live baby lying there. The mother stammered. The woman's lips trembled. She moved them as if to whisper something before repeating it aloud. There lay the child. He was already frozen because he had managed to wriggle out of his diaper and blanket. I stared at him in mute shock, hesitant to pick him up. I looked around, realizing that the baby must have a mother, but there was no one. Then I grabbed the baby, wrapped him up, opened my jacket and pressed on my chest, covering him from the cold. The baby started making sounds, touching me with his little hands, and I quickly ran back to the church. I flew up the steps in seconds, but when I touched the doorknob, I didn't open the door. Michael saw his mom's hands begin to tremble. He squeezed them himself, hoping to calm her down. Tears were streaming down her face. Scott, who until then had been standing by the window, looking up at the sky, turned to his wife. He took a step toward the table where his wife and son were sitting. The husband lowered himself next to the woman. He placed a hand on her shoulder, encouraging her. She barely bent her head to his palm, accepting his support, exclaimed, wiped away her tears, then spoke again. I couldn't give him up, the woman confessed. I could feel his little heart in my chest. Your heart, Michael, your heart, beating like a little hummingbird. So quickly, so desperately, the thought struck me of how cruel it was to leave you here in the cold. For if I hadn't come by morning, you would have frozen to death. Then I remembered that I had been so cruel to my own child. And then your fist grasped a strand of my hair, and you smacked your lips and whimpered. You were hungry, cold, tired. My hand shook, but I held you tighter to me. As if to prove her words, his mother squeezed Michael's fingers hard. He listened to her in shock, recognizing his past. I turned around and ran like a thief to the car, looking around, afraid of being called or caught. When I arrived with you in my arms, Scott was in shock. He said we should call the police. He thought the baby had been stolen. But I had already fallen in love with you. That night I had a miscarriage. Only this time we didn't tell anyone. We buried the baby and left you in its place. Everyone I knew was convinced I'd finally given birth. The doctor said I had a home birth. It was becoming more and more popular at the time. I made up stories about giving birth in the bathtub, about being at one with nature, that it was this comfortable environment that helped me give birth for the third time. Did you stay with us, son? Michael exhaled heavily. This tragic story was seeping into his consciousness. Gradually it was digested by him, forced him to accept new facts, which his mind could hardly perceive. It's not easy to spend your whole life thinking that your parents are related, and then find out such shocking details. However, that turned out not to be all. The mother continued. Who are your real parents? I don't know. There were no other children there. However, Scott kept watching the news, dreading to see a story about a lost boy. Then he came across a similar case. A baby boy had been abandoned in the same neighborhood the same night. He was found by a man taking out the garbage. The baby's mother was never found. The baby was given to an orphanage. We thought it was a strange coincidence, but maybe I scared that woman away and she didn't have time to leave the other baby at the church. Maybe it was your blood brother who became your donor. Is that really possible? The mother looked at her son in confusion, then at her husband, and then shifted her gaze back to Michael. No one present had an answer to this question. However, Michael was determined that he would definitely find it. Sometime later, Michael again hired a private investigator, the same one who had helped him find Audrey's brother's fiancée. A week later, Aiden, a private investigator, arrived with news. Patrick went into an orphanage right after he was born. He said, I haven't gotten all the details yet, but I can tell you something. He looked for the papers in the folder, and with a nod continued. He was found by the garbage cans. The case made the news in January. The child was sent to the hospital, and from there to an orphanage. At first, everyone felt sorry for the baby, so foster parents were found almost immediately. Rich businessmen who needed to save their marriage and reputation. The man was seen in suspicious scams, so the couple wanted to whitewash themselves. The detective showed Michael pictures of the brother's adoptive parents. What went wrong? Michael marveled. And Audrey said that Patrick was in an orphanage, that he had no relatives. The detective nodded. This is the second part of the story, he said, pulling out more pictures, this time with young Patrick. When the buzz around the baby died down, our rich people realized that the baby wasn't that wanted. They got their PR, as eyewitnesses say. The couple was in constant conflict. At first, they hoped that the baby would make up with them, help to return not only the public's favor, but also love. However, it did not work out. The child constantly cried, was sick a lot. In general, behaved like a normal baby, which they were not ready for. Instead of the happiness of motherhood and fatherhood, they got a headache. In the end, the spouses divorced with a scandal. Neither of them wanted to take responsibility for someone else's child. Both went abroad to different countries, leaving the child in an orphanage. The foster parents gave up their son when he turned 4, the detective continued. In case you're wondering, they both went bankrupt. What happened to the grieving mom? I don't know, I can find out. But the deadbeat dad ended up going to prison for an economic crime. I don't need to find out what good that would do now, Michael said sadly, looking at the pictures of his brother. You can't bring my brother back, and you can't change his fate. We were both thrown away like garbage, except that he was betrayed twice. He lived in an orphanage when I was with kind, loving parents. Not only did I get a family, I got his heart. Somehow that doesn't seem fair at all. The detective cast an inquisitive glance at his client. Usually he remained professional to the last, but now he couldn't help but be struck by the story of the 2 unmasked twins. I'm sorry, the detective said. Michael nodded hesitantly, still staring at the photographs. They evoked a strange feeling in his soul. It was as if he were looking at himself. There was a copy of himself in the pictures, except that there were no such moments in his past. Here he sits with a guitar and smiles at the photographer, a fluffy red cat at his feet. Here he is hugging his girlfriend. Later, Michael sat in a bar with his friend Jack. Jack was downing a Scotch whiskey. Michael took a swig of plain water. Michael wanted to drink something strong today, but he didn't dare to do that to his health, especially after his brother had given him a part of himself. I didn't even know I had a brother, exhaled the man, still in shock. And now it's too late. Jack glanced at his companion, shook his head. He tapped his friend on the shoulder. Leave it alone, Michael. What's the use? There's no reason to feel sorry for yourself, he said softly. You couldn't have done anything because you didn't know. It wasn't your fault. You were just luckier that night. And if you want to thank your brother in any way, you must realize that you have more responsibility now. You have to be happy for both of us. Michael, you know what? Let's split it in half. With those words, Brian poured whiskey out of his glass. Emptying his buddy's glass, the amber liquid filled it just a little, covering the bottom. Michael looked at it detachedly, picked up his friend's glass, tipped the drink into himself, letting it burn his gut. Warmth spread inside, warming his chest. Suddenly, a plate of cheese was nearby. He grabbed a piece of cheese, popping it into his mouth. Hey, what about his fiancée, Audrey? Have you seen her yet? Michael shook his head negatively. I don't know what to say, and how to show up either. I don't think she wants to see the face of her dead fiancé. But from what you've told me, I'm sure my face looks better than the face of the old man she's living with. That's her grandfather, Michael explained. He remembered the old man's face with annoyance. More than once he had thought of the girl running out of his house, of the way he had shouted after her. I want to help her with money or something, he admitted. That's the right thing to do, Jack nodded, indicating approvingly on the cheese plate. Another week passed, and Michael was still hesitant to return to Audrey's house. He did, however, after more news from the detective. Your brother has a son, he informed her during another meeting. Audrey had given birth to a child 6 months after Patrick's death. They were not officially married. The information passed us by, and then there is no exact certainty that it is his child, but the painful one was born now. The very next day, Michael came again to the cottage village. He knocked on the door, and Audrey opened it. She turned pale again, seeing the face of the dead fiancé. It was obvious how she was blushing and trying to come to her senses. It's you again, Michael, she nodded. May I come in? I have some news. The girl led him into the house and sat him at the table, offered him tea and cookies. Michael thanked her, but did not touch the food. He told her the story of the lost and exposed twins, about how Patrick's heart had turned out to be the perfect donor organ. Even the doctors were amazed. No one knew it was his brother's. "Tell me, Audrey, do you have a child?" "Is it Patrick's baby?" Michael asked softly. "Yes, we wanted to get married. We were saving up money for the wedding. I didn't want a big celebration, but he told me it had to be special. He said I deserved the best." Audrey smiled sadly. "But my pregnancy forced us to hurry. We applied for the registry office as soon as I found out I was expecting a child. I was so nervous at the time. I kept dreaming of a princess dress, but now I thought it wouldn't fit my belly. Patrick reassured me, said it wouldn't show when I was a baby. And then he died." "Yes, then he died," Audrey nodded. "It made me feel so bad. Nervous breakdowns, exhaustion. The doctors fought so hard to get me to pull myself together, but I couldn't. I got depressed. Felt like I was in quicksand. It was dragging me down. I gave birth to Wyatt, our son, prematurely because of me. The baby has a lot of health problems. My son is in the hospital now," Audrey said. "I have to be with him, but bills have to be paid, so I'm working. I was hoping to sell Patrick's apartment and pay for my son's treatment, except I'm nobody on his paperwork, so they kicked me out. Now I live here with my grandfather. I don't think he's as bad as you think he is. He just drinks a lot, makes moonshine for himself and the neighbors to sell." The girl averted her eyes, hiding her true feelings in them. His heart clenched in Michael's chest. He sincerely empathized with Audrey's grief. "You don't worry about your son," he said firmly. "I'm taking care of him, and the brothers could not. But my nephew can. You don't owe us anything." "Oh, my brother." I do. The woman shook her head and looked away. "There's not enough money to pay that debt," Michael said flatly. And he kept his promise. And he took custody of Audrey and her baby. Little Wyatt was placed in an excellent private clinic, and he recovered quickly. After another month, Michael found Audrey a good place to live. A 2-bedroom apartment in the center with a spacious kitchen and a beautiful children's room. When Audrey first entered the apartment and saw the blue and white wallpaper with painted lighthouses, between which swam charming whales, she could not hold back tears. The young woman turned to Michael, hugged him tightly, and said, "Thank you, I am so grateful to you." Michael smiled, holding the petite brunette tightly to him. They had grown very close over the past few months. They had long since switched to you. Michael could feel Audrey taking up more and more space in his heart, except that his own feelings made him uneasy. Sometimes he thought about Valentina's words and wondered if they were his emotions or left over from the previous owner of his heart. Whatever the answer was, Michael hesitated to look for it. He couldn't do that to Jessica. She had dreamed of marrying him, talking more and more often about the registry office. Now she was pulling her own company, while the groom was in rehab. Michael was very grateful to Jessica, although he realized that there was very little love in his feelings at all. He appreciated her, but more and more as a friend. While in Audrey he found a kindred spirit. The young girl was interesting, well-read. They could walk for hours, discussing books, news, movies, talking about plans for the future. Audrey listened with interest about the man's company, even offered some good ideas. They both loved old black and white movies and world history. They argued passionately on various topics, discussing famous people. Audrey always said what she thought without trying to be liked. He appreciated her for her sincerity. When Michael learned that Audrey had a college degree, but worked in a fish cannery, he offered her the best secretary position in his company. "My secretary has to go on maternity leave in a month and a half," he said. "You can take her place, but you'd better come out now, so she can teach you everything. And then, when we've thought about what department to put you in, what do you think?" "And I think I'll take any job that doesn't smell like sprats." Audrey laughed then. Her laughter rang out like a silver bell, echoing in Michael's chest. And so they decided. Audrey became an official employee of the company. One day, Michael decided to visit the girl, to see how she was doing in her new position, and to check the situation at the workplace. He intended in the near future to regain the reins of the company. After a complicated surgery, then the story with his twin brother had knocked him out, but he was already recovering. That afternoon, when he arrived at the office for work, he found no one there. Neither Jessica nor Casper's deputy was there. Calling Audrey, he found out that the girl had been sent on an errand. Michael walked to his office, feeling good. He liked to work after all. Of course, now he wouldn't work like an eternal laborer. However, Michael's fingertips were twitching with the desire to get down to business. Michael had acquired many new ideas during his absence that he wanted to implement. He walked around the office, fed the fish in the aquarium, then went to his desk. He didn't find his belongings, but he wasn't embarrassed. If Jessica occupied his office, She could organize everything to her liking. The man picked up the file folder and studied it with interest. However, the contents surprised him. According to the papers, Michael's company was once again offered to buy. For a long time, the firms have been competitors. Takeover offers began to come in about 10 years ago. The amount was steadily increasing. Of course, both Scott and his son Michael ignored these offers, except that Jessica and Casper didn't seem to agree with them. There was a sudden sound outside the door, and Michael's hands trembled, and he dropped the papers in surprise. The papers scattered in a fan under the desk. Damn innovations! Michael bent down and began to pick them up. As soon as he was under the desk, the office door swung open. Jessica and Casper walked in. Michael recognized their cheerful voices. He wanted to come out of hiding right away to figure out the origin of the strange documents about the purchase and sale of the company. Except that when he heard his fiancée's words, he froze and fell silent. "Close the door," Jessica said with a giggle, "because of this new secretary. I'm terrified of that fool, my fiancé's girlfriend. Sometimes I think that he put her there on purpose to keep an eye on us." "Come on," Michael's as gullible as a house cat. He can't see beyond his own nose. Otherwise, he would have realized that the company and his fiancée were being stolen from him, Casper replied. Jessica giggled again. Despite his dismissive tone, Casper closed the door to the office. "Come here," he playfully muttered. There were sounds that were hard to confuse with anything else. The lovers were kissing right in Michael's office. Slowly but surely, a rage flared in the man's chest. Still sitting under the desk, he clutched the papers in his hands. "How are your wedding preparations going, by the way?" Casper asked, pulling away from the woman kissing him. "Keep in mind, Jessica, if you do not become his lawfully wedded wife, nothing will happen. I have him in my arms, so everything will be fine. We didn't apply because he was sick. Then there was some stupid Brazilian drama with his twin brother. I think a rush would have been suspicious. He was too upset," Jessica grudgingly admitted. "It's all in the past, though. I think they'll take him to the registry office in a couple of weeks. We'll be married. And I'll be able to take half of his property, in addition to the company." "You're wicked," Casper said with admiration. "I love you." "No, I'm not mean. And I earned it all," Jessica said. "Actually, I took care of him while he was sick with his heart. Although, if he died then, it would have been less of a problem. I'd have played the inconsolable widow, and his old folks would have kept me company. They could have made a baby with you, and they'd be told it was their grandchild." The lovers laughed again. The temptation to appear in front of the mean people and see the fright and shock on their faces was great, but Michael decided that revenge should be served cold. He picked up his phone and texted Audrey. "Audrey, get Jessica and Casper out of my office. They need to get off the floor now." Thankfully, Audrey didn't bother to demand an explanation. Girl, she was understanding and apparently determined, because within a couple minutes the man heard the sound of the fire alarm. The sensor in the room went off, flooding the room with water. Jessica shrieked. Casper cursed. They jumped up from the couch, discussing on the fly what could have happened. Michael waited until the couple left the office and ran downstairs to find out from the guards what had happened. Then he climbed out from behind his desk and rushed out of the office. In the doorway, he bumped into Audrey. She was in soaked clothes, green eyes wide open. "Michael," she exclaimed, wiping the water off her face. "I didn't know what to do. Bringing up the lighter and giving it a check was the first thing I thought of." Despite his anger, Michael suddenly laughed. The sight of a drenched Audrey made him relax. "The idea of just knocking on the door and calling them somewhere didn't occur to you," he grinned. Audrey looked at him in surprise, as if wondering how she hadn't thought of it. "No," she said, embarrassed, but she exclaimed immediately, "But it was spectacular, wasn't it?" And the fire department finally turned off the alarm. The guards must have realized there was no fire, and the sprinkler system had failed. Michael looked toward the elevator and the stairs that led to the office floor. Surely Jessica and Casper must be about to return. He glanced at a confused Audrey. An unexpected thought crossed his mind. He realized what he wanted and how he could get back at Jessica and Casper. "Audrey, do you want to marry me?" he blurted out. The girl, who had been trying to tidy her hair, froze and looked at him. Blinking in astonishment, she mouthed, "Michael, there was no fire. You weren't breathing carbon monoxide." She smiled, but the smile was confused. "No, I'm sorry. I mean the sham marriage," Michael corrected himself. His heart twinged, though, as if disappointed by the remark. "I need someone I can trust, Audrey." He briefly explained the situation to her. The girl shook her head, thinking his idea delusional. "It's about as crazy as pulling the fire alarm to get your boss out of his office," Michael said, looking at Audrey slyly. Audrey's cheeks flushed. I was helping out a friend, not my boss, she said grudgingly. Michael's chest felt good again. Fortunately, it didn't take long to convince Audrey to help him again. The young people applied for a marriage license. Michael paid for them to get married in a week. At the same time, he returned to the company office without warning and found a lock on his place. Casper's face reflected surprise, but he quickly suppressed that feeling by smiling broadly. "Buddy," Casper exclaimed, standing up from his desk, "what are you doing here? Did you come to see us?" Michael grinned. "And you've been warming my seat," he nodded at his chair. "It's comfortable." Casper was not confused, waved his hands. "What are you? It was just unseemly to meet people in my office. This place is more conducive to making good deals," he said quickly. Michael nodded, agreeing slowly. Under Casper's gaze, he walked to the aquarium, picked up the food again, and poured it over the fish. Watching the scalarias and guppies swim for their treats, suddenly Jessica entered the study. Her heels clacking, she smiled broadly as she looked at Casper, and without noticing Michael, she exclaimed, "Hello, my love." He made frightened eyes, glanced toward the aquarium, prayed, turned around, and turned sharply pale. "Hello, my darling," she repeated, rushing toward Michael. "I heard your voice and came running at once." The woman hung on to him, but he pulled away, wrinkling his nose in disgust. "Jessica, leave this circus, please. I've come to you with news," he said, shaking the rest of the fish food off his palm and sending the crumbs into the water. Jessica shifted from foot to foot in confusion. "I heard a rumor that the company my father built from the ground up is being sold," Michael said icily. There was an oppressive silence in the office. Casper was the first to break the stupor, sighing theatrically. "And you believed these rumors? Surely the competitors are spreading them to sink us. Don't tell me you came running here because of a ridiculous rumor. Relax, your company is in good hands." "You're right. It is in good hands," Michael nodded. Casper wanted to answer something, but another character appeared on the stage, Audrey. She rushed in like a small whirlwind. Everyone looked at the young, pretty woman. Michael involuntarily admired, thinking, what a beauty Audrey is. The grief was gradually letting go of the woman. She smiled more and more often, was able to spend a lot of time with her son. She knew that he was well taken care of. Hope in her soul and Michael's care allowed this flower to bloom again and open its delicate petals. Green eyes the color of malachite shone with delight. There was a beautiful pink blush on her cheeks and a smile on her lips. Finding Michael's gaze, the brunette smiled even wider. "Michael," she exclaimed, "I just got a call from the hospital. I can take Wyatt home. He's fine. He's going to be fine now." "That's wonderful news," he exclaimed in response, scooping her up in his arms. Audrey laughed, wrapping her arms around his neck. Tears glistened in the corners of her eyes, this time from happiness. Not everyone, however, shared the couple's jubilation. Laura blushed, and then covered with white spots. "What is this?" "Get away, we're talking here," she shouted unpleasantly, turning to Audrey. "What do you think you're doing? Why are you hanging on to someone else's fiancé?" "Michael, that's not normal." "You shouldn't talk to her like that," Michael advised, taking his time to let Audrey go. His hand was holding her waist, which didn't escape Jessica's gaze. "Why is that?" "Because you took pity on her and took her in like a puppy." "A puppy," Jessica snickered. "Only she's still a secretary, the lowest link in the chain of this company. I'm sick of your philanthropy. I'm sick of your charity work." Michael couldn't contain his smile, which infuriated Jessica even more. His next words shocked both lovers. "You're talking to my legal spouse, Jessica, Audrey Michael," he informed her. The big news had the effect of a bomb going off. Jessica retreated 2 steps and almost stumbled on her heels. "What the hell are you talking about?" she exhaled convulsively. "It's not nonsense. We got married. Audrey owns the company as much as I do. What about you? I've decided that I just can't do anything bad to you, Jessica, because you've done so much for me. I don't want you to tie your life to a man you don't love for the sake of some money." He curled his lips and shook his head. "What are you talking about, Jessica?" he asked, clenching his fists. "You're in love with Casper." He nodded toward Frank. "What's more, you guys are worth each other. You are equally vile and despicable individuals, so I wish you all the best, but as far away from me and my company as possible. You're both fired. The order's already been given and signed." "You can't do this to me," Jessica screamed hysterically. "I cared about you." "Like you take care of a good purse," the man spat out, looking at his ex-fiancée with contempt. You know, Jessica, I can't even figure out what pisses me off more, the fact that you betrayed me, or the fact that you wanted to get rid of my father's company. You knew how much she meant to me, and you made the deal anyway. Or maybe that's the reason. The woman jumped. You were obsessed with your company, and you didn't even pay attention to me, and you decided that the best way to win back my affection was to have sex with Frank. Michael raised his eyebrows, unable to stand her nervous laughter. Jessica, calm down, you've lost. So get your stuff and vacate the office. However, Jessica didn't want to listen to him. As if mad, she grabbed the statue from the table with a shout. It's all you. You told him about the sale. She rushed at Audrey. The girl was so astonished that she didn't even think of dodging. She froze in place, looking at Jessica. Michael was faster. He covered his spouse, so the statue hit his shoulder. Grabbing Jessica and snatching the statue out of her hands, Michael pushed the blonde away, breathing heavily with indignation. Jessica, if you don't leave, I'll call the police myself, he promised. Frank, this concerns you too. The lovers were forced to leave the office, slamming the door behind them. Michael gave them a grim look and turned to Audrey. Looking into her face, he asked her thoughtfully, Are you all right? Are you scared? Blinking, the girl shrugged her thin shoulders. To be honest, I didn't have time to be scared for you, she admitted. I didn't realize what she was holding. I thought that if you got hit on the head again, you'd get away with a concussion. Michael had a sudden urge for Audrey to touch his face with her fingers, just as she had when they'd first met. His gaze slid to the girl's pale pink lips. At that moment, he didn't care, whose feelings were tearing at his chest. He realized that he just couldn't hold them back any longer and had to let his emotions come out. Michael slowly leaned in, as if to allow Audrey to pull away, but she didn't. The brunette's eyelids drooped and she leaned forward, allowing the man to touch her lips. The kiss was tender, long-awaited, and full of a kind of relief, as if a weight had been lifted from their shoulders, as if wings had grown and they could fly. That's strange, he laughed. We're already married, and I kissed you for the first time. Audrey smiled too. Embarrassed by this turn, she hid her face against his chest, letting herself be pressed against him. She could hear her heart beating fast and happily in her husband's chest. It had been 5 years since Michael and Audrey got married. However, the wedding had to be reenacted. Michael decided that Audrey should have a dress with a corset, which she dreamed of. He fulfilled every wish of his beloved wife. Their son Wyatt was healthy, even though he was monitored by doctors. Also at the spouses grew up a year-old daughter, Emily. Michael, as promised, lived for two, for himself and for his brother. Over time, he began to notice what Jack was talking about. The man's tastes and habits were indeed changing. Sometimes he remembered something he couldn't have known. He began to like detectives, though he had previously read only nonfiction, memoirs and biographies. His brother, as it turned out, had a whole collection of books by Agatha Christie, Arthur Conan Doyle, and James Hadley Chase. One evening, Michael realized that he wanted to run his fingers over the strings of the guitar, although he could not play. His brother, on the other hand, played the guitar perfectly. At times like this, he felt as if Jack were reaching out to him, waving, reminding him of himself. He wasn't forgotten, though. The doctors, who said that Michael would live with a new heart for 12 to 15 years, were no longer so sure. This organ was so suitable that the prognosis became surprisingly optimistic, even fantastic. It was simply a miracle. Of course, Michael had always felt that life had been unfair to his sibling, except that he couldn't fix it. But he could make a better life for his favorite woman and his child, and Michael also hoped that part of his brother's soul remained in his chest, which meant he was still alive, and let him look at the world through the eyes of his twin brother and breathe with his lungs, but he loves with his heart. Overhearing the conversation between her son and daughter-in-law, Maria Petrovna was numb. She heard such a thing, she gathered. Albert, we can't go on like this. Linda exclaimed indignantly. How much longer are we going to be crammed into this tiny room? The baby's coming, and we don't even have a place to put the cot. What can I do? Albert didn't even turn round, still staring at the monitor. You know, we can't take out a mortgage, we need money for a down payment. And because of your whims, we can't save up any money. Let's move in with your parents. They have a bigger flat than this one, 2 rooms, but separate. And the kitchen is bigger. Linda. And your mummy will live here alone like a queen. Besides, you know my daddy's very sick. He needs peace and quiet. Besides, he and my mum live in separate rooms. And you're suggesting we put them in the same room? They'd fight all the time. Mummy likes to watch soap operas all day and Daddy hates them. No, I'm not going to let my parents be bullied. Yeah, Albert nodded. So you can bully my mum? He raised his voice. She already doesn't know where to get away from your eternal discontent. She only comes into the kitchen when you're not home. And she's the landlady, not you. So live with your mum, Linda cried. I'll go away. And when the baby is born, I'll raise it myself. And you won't even see it. Linda, calm down, Albert hugged his wife. You mustn't worry. I'll think of something. Just be patient. Amelia sat on the sofa in the next room and listened to the conversation between her son and daughter-in-law. What can you think of? She sighed heavily. Albert works all day long as it is. Even on Saturdays, he is not at home. His salary is small, he can't afford a flat. I can understand Linda too. She wants to be the boss of her own flat. And here I am, an old woman, disturbing them. She lay down on the sofa and closed her eyes, trying to sleep, but sleep did not come to her. But memories came back to her mind. Amelia had raised Albert alone, without a husband. As it happened, she was unattractive, tall, thin. And she didn't dress fashionably. What man would pay attention to such a thing? She came to the city from the country. She entered a school for painters and plasterers, lived in a dormitory. And after graduation, she got a job in a construction organization, from which she got a small room in a communal flat. She worked on weekends, went to the village, helped her mother to take care of the vegetable garden. Her mother called her back home, but Amelia refused. I don't want to go back to the village. There's nothing to do here, and it's not interesting, she said. You can't go back to your parents' house. Her mother chastised her. You should have looked for a bloke here. You'd get married, and then you'd have kids. But you live in your town like an old woman. You'll end up like an old maid. You're nearly 30 years old, and you've never even had a man, have you? Amelia resented her mother and promised she wouldn't visit her for a long time after such talk. But on Saturday, she took the bus back to her home village. She had no friends in the city, and those with whom she was friends were married, had children, and were busy with their own worries. The only thing left was to spend all her weekends in the village. And on Monday morning, the first bus back to the city. It was on this bus that she met Nicholas, who was returning from the wedding of an army friend. He helped her carry the heavy bag of potatoes and pickles her mother had packed to the house where she lived, and suggested that they meet the next day. Amelia was hesitant at first, but then agreed. She liked Nicholas for his courtesy and his easy, cheerful disposition. At work all day, she thought about what she would wear on her first date, and decided to wear a dark blue skirt and a white jumper. She didn't have anything else in her wardrobe. You look like you're dressed for a party meeting, Nicholas joked when he saw Amelia. All right, no offense. It was a joke. Well, why don't we not go to the cinema, but take a walk in the park? Amelia suggested. She was afraid to stay with Nicholas in the dark, even in the cinema, which was full of people. Well, in the park. So in the park, he took her by the hand. Can I buy you an ice cream? He asked. When he saw that the girl shook her head negatively, he shrugged again. They walked leisurely along the park alley and talked. Or rather, Nicholas spoke alone, and Amelia listened to him attentively and laughed at his jokes. Once a young lieutenant was sent to our unit, Nicholas said with a laugh. As soon as I saw him, I was stunned. It turned out to be Austin. He and I lived in the same house, even went to the same school. Only he was a few years younger. I was in my second year of service, soon to be discharged. So Nicholas lit a cigarette. I met a girl at that time, even you could say. We had an affair. All my leave was spent with her. And it was a young business. I wanted to see her more often. But you can't go, oh, Walla Patrol will stop you at once. Yes, they can put you in the brig, and then you won't be able to see her at all. So that's what I came up with. I started asking Austin for his lieutenant's uniform. Officers' uniforms didn't stop patrols in the city, so they could move around freely. Took me a long time to convince him that countrymen should help each other out, that sort of thing. And I did, because when Austin was on holiday, I'd put on his uniform and go out on the town. I did it once, I did it again. And the third time I came back to the unit, I ran into my own Oliver. How surprised he was to see me wearing my lieutenant's epaulettes. I never went on leave again for the rest of my tour. What did they do to Austin? Did they punish him too? Amelia asked anxiously. No, Nicholas waved his hand. I didn't give him away. He said he'd borrowed the uniform, and from whom I do not know. From Nicholas's story, Amelia learned that he lived in a hostel and worked at the factory as a milling machine operator. He has never been married and has no plans to marry. It's too early for me to have a family, he said, and lit another cigarette. I look at my friends who have already got married. So it's a deadly bore. And if you get a bad wife, it's a disaster. My maid Ashley, he's rushing home after work. I say to him, Ashley, let's have a beer. Take the edge off, and he tells me that if his wife smells alcohol, she'll make a scene, and from his body for a week. And what about the children? Amelia wondered. Don't you want to be a father already? Children? Nicholas grinned. I never wanted to have them. It's a lot of trouble. First you have to get up at night, then take them to daycare, then do homework with them, and how much money is spent on them. And in the end, you don't know what your son or daughter will grow up to be. Our foreman Michael's son went downhill. Got mixed up with a bad crowd. Almost ended up in juvie. What's he got to look forward to? Father's a respectable man, mother's a librarian, and the kid grows up to be a thug. Maybe he lacked parental attention. Amelia suggested. The son has shoes, clothes. What kind of attention is needed? Nicholas objected. Nobody took care of me when I was a kid either. My father died early. My mother worked 2 jobs to feed me and my sister. And nothing. I grew up a decent man. I work, and I send money to my mother. Amelia didn't answer, though she disagreed with Nicholas about family and children. Perhaps he doesn't realize yet that children are a great happiness, she thought. How can one not love them? They walked round the park some more, and Nicholas walked Amelia home. He didn't ask her out again, and Amelia decided that she didn't like Nicholas, and he didn't want to continue hanging out with her anymore. She was surprised to see Nicholas sitting on a bench outside her driveway a few days later on her way home from work. Oh, Amelia was embarrassed, adjusting the dress she'd been wearing that day. I didn't even expect to see you again. Maybe we should go for a walk, Nicholas suggested, getting up from the bench. The weather's so nice. Amelia nodded her head in agreement, and they walked towards the small square. She was very embarrassed by her appearance, but Nicholas didn't seem to mind. He was joking again, talking ironically about his friends, and not asking Amelia about anything. Yes, she had nothing to tell about herself. She lived in the village, studied, now she works. That's all. Would anyone be interested in that? At the entrance, Nicholas suggested that Amelia meet at the weekend and still go to the cinema for an interesting film that had recently been released. Once again, Amelia agreed. She was very pleased that a guy like Nicholas was paying attention to her. So they started dating. And 2 months later, Nicholas stayed in her room for a sleepover. Amelia did not want to invite him to the flat, but he was persistent, saying that he would only have a cup of tea and go to his dormitory. How they ended up in the same bed, Amelia didn't exactly realize. Nicholas's kisses were so sweet that she felt as if she had lost her head. So I'm your first man? Nicholas asked in surprise. I didn't expect it. Why didn't you tell me right away? I would have been more gentle with you. Amelia didn't say anything. She was ashamed. She sat on the bed with her legs tucked under her and the blanket covering her. Why are you so scared, you silly girl? Nicholas tried to touch Amelia, but she recoiled. You should have had your baby a long time ago. And you've been walking around? He swore foully. Well, I'm going to go. It's getting late. They might not let me into the dormitory. We're strict about that. After seeing Nicholas off, Amelia went back to her room and couldn't sleep until morning, remembering what had happened between them. I don't even know what he'll think of me now, Amelia worried. And he'll refuse to date me, since I'm so easily available. But Nicholas began to visit her 2 or 3 times a week. Sometimes they went to the cinema, but more often Amelia fed him dinner, and then they went to bed, and Nicholas stayed with her all night. I wish I could marry him, Amelia looked fondly at the sleeping Nicholas. Why, he's a hard-working bloke. And the fact that he drinks a lot of beer is no big deal. That's why he's a man. And who doesn't drink nowadays? Amelia closed her eyes and imagined herself in a white wedding dress and long veil. As she and Nicholas walked out of the registry office, he picks her up in his arms and twirls her round and round, and Amelia laughed happily. She rarely visited her mother in the village. No time. We have a lot of work, Amelia justified. I've gone to work at the factory. I'll become an apprentice. True, my room had to be returned, and I had to move to a dormitory. But they say that they give flats to the front runners of production. So I'm trying my best. I want so much to have a separate place where I would be a mistress. It's time for you to get married. That's what my mother said admonishingly. You are getting on in years. Are you going to stay a maiden? I will not. Amelia lowered her eyes. She hadn't told her mother about Nicholas yet, although they had been dating for a year. When they moved into the dormitory, they didn't see each other as often as before. Only when her roommate Jessie worked a different shift or went to her family for the weekend, Nicholas would come to Amelia's house and stay until the morning. But lately he'd been coming less and less often. Amelia waited for him, heating dinner, and then cried into her pillow. One day on her day off, Amelia had breakfast with her roommate Jessie. She had cooked a delicious scrambled egg and was now happily eating it, helping with a slice of bread. Amelia had barely brought her fork to her mouth when she felt dizzy and barely made it to the toilet. "What's the matter with you?" Jessie asked in surprise. "Are you pregnant?" "I'm not." Amelia smiled strangely. "I must have been poisoned yesterday. I bought a pie on the street. I thought it looked suspicious." "Yeah," Jessie grinned. "My mom's been pregnant 5 times and she used to say the same thing. For milk, for pies. You should go to a woman's doctor and get yourself checked out. Don't tell me you've never been with a bloke. I found cigarette butts in my room more than once. So you brought him here while I was away." Amelia blushed up to her ears and skewed her lower lip. "You think it was me? There's no way anyone could have come into the room." Go to the clinic." Jessie continued to insist. "It won't be too late. You can have an abortion before it's too late. What are you going to do with a child now? No flat, no mother to help you." "All right." Amelia nodded her head. "To calm you down, I'll go to the doctor, then we'll laugh together." But there was no laughing. Amelia was indeed pregnant. She came out of the antenatal clinic and didn't know what to do next. Sitting down on a bench, Amelia thought, "We should tell Nicholas everything. As it happens, he has to marry me now. He's not going to give up his own child." She cheered up, got up from the bench, and went home. Waiting until the weekend, when Jeezy was away at her parents' house, Amelia waited for Nicholas to tell him that he was going to be a father. Nicholas was late that day and didn't arrive until the evening drunk. A friend had a son, he told Amelia from the doorstep, so we had a little celebration. He came into the room and sat down on a chair. He already had 2 daughters, but Scott just wanted a son. A son is a son. Nicholas held up his index finger. An heir. "What would you do if you knew you were going to have a son soon?" Amelia asked cautiously. Nicholas hesitated. "The devil knows." He put his foot on his leg. "Never thought about it." "And if you think about it?" Amelia looked at him slyly. "Well, I suppose I'd be glad," Nicholas said uncertainly. "Why do you ask such questions?" "Well, then rejoice." Amelia clapped her hands. "I'm pregnant, and I'm sure that we'll have a boy." Stop. Nicholas wiped his face with the palm of his hand. "Who's having a boy? Me and you." Amelia's joy faded a little. "We do. I've already been to the doctor who confirmed that I'm going to be a mum, and you're going to be a dad. Isn't that great? Now you and I can get married and get our own flat as soon as possible." "Married?" Nicholas was startled. "Why? What do you mean?" Amelia was upset. "We need our child to have a mum and a dad. Or do you mind?" Her eyes filled with tears. "I don't mind in principle." Nicholas got up from his chair. and started walking toward the door. "I'm going to go. I need to think it over. I'll come back tomorrow and we'll talk about it." "Okay," Amelia agreed nonchalantly. "Tomorrow is tomorrow, but come before lunchtime, because Jay-Z might be back early." But neither tomorrow, nor the day after tomorrow, nor a week later, Nicholas did not come. Desperate, Amelia went to the neighboring factory to look for Nicholas and find out what had happened to him. But she was shocked by the news that Nicholas Morris had been paid and had gone somewhere. Not even his closest mates knew where. Amelia couldn't believe that Nicholas had abandoned her, too. Not just her, but their unborn child. "What am I going to do now?" she sobbed as she sank into her pillow. What? Jesse grinned. "You need an abortion. It's no big deal. You're not the first, you're not the last." "I'm not going to kill my baby." Amelia covered her still flat belly with her hands. "I'll raise it myself alone, and we don't need no daddy." She buried her head in the pillow again and cried even louder. "Yes, it's a mess," sighed Jay-Z. "What are you going to tell your mother? I thought you said she was strict." "Aha," Amelia exclaimed. "I'll have to tell her. She wouldn't kill her own daughter. Besides, she'd just been dreaming of grandchildren." The next weekend, Amelia went to the village. Mrs. Anna shook her head. "I haven't heard a word from you for 2 months. Come on, get dressed and go to the garden. You can help dig potatoes." Amelia dug potatoes, but refused to take the buckets full of them into the cellar. "What's the matter?" Mrs. Anna was angry. "The town has spoiled you so much that you can't help your mother." "I shouldn't be lifting weights right now." Amelia lowered her eyes. "The doctor said not to." "Is something wrong? Are you ill?" Mrs. Anna looked at her daughter anxiously. "What did the doctor say?" "Mom, I'm pregnant." Amelia, after a moment's silence, blurted out at the top of her lungs and backed away, afraid her mother would hit her with a spade. "Yes," said Mrs. Anna. "It's a long way off. If there's a hole, there'll be a hole. Who's the father? Do you know him well?" Amelia dodged the question. "Well, we met." Mrs. Anna rubbed her lower back. "Come next weekend. I'll heat the sauna, set the table. Come on. The future son-in-law can butter me up. He can bring me a glass of water in my old age." "It's only my child." Amelia lowered her head. "I will bring him up alone." Said Mrs. Anna. "I've lost my maiden honor and forgotten it. Have you thought how I'll look in people's eyes? They'll say Amelia Robinson's a girl in an interesting position. What a shame." Mrs. Anna was indignant. "What do you think I should do?" "Do what?" Amelia took a couple of steps back again. "Give birth, of course. I'm not getting rid of the baby, and I don't care if they point the finger at me." "What can I do with you now?" Mrs. Anna sighed. "The girl's not old enough. Maybe a child will brighten your loneliness." In the evening, they sat at the table for a long time, discussing how to live their lives and what would be best for the unborn baby. They decided that Amelia would stay in town so that there would be no cause for rumors in the village. And it was better to give birth there. The doctors were close by. She'll also go to the trade union and push for a separate flat. Like a single mom. Mrs. Anna will sell all the animals, close the house, and move in with her daughter to help with the baby. Amelia will go to work because she has to earn money. There's no one else to help. And Mrs. Ann will look after her grandson and run the household. Just a month before the birth, Amelia moved into a small one-room flat, and soon Mrs. Anna arrived from the village. At the due date, Amelia gave birth to a son, whom she named Albert. When in the maternity hospital she was brought her son for the first time and pressed him to her breast, she immediately realized that this boy was the meaning of her life. 3 months later, Amelia went to work. For some reason, she had no milk, and the pediatrician advised her to switch the boy to formula feeding. Because of this, Amelia was very worried about not being able to feed her son herself. She wanted to give her child the best, so she did not refuse any overtime, sometimes working 2 shifts in a row at the machine. The foreman turned a blind eye to this. For him, the main thing was to fulfill the plan. Mrs. Anna finally settled in the city. Only she wouldn't sell her house in the village. When Albert grows up, she said, we'll go to the village for the whole summer. Let the boy Albert breathe fresh air. 2 years later, the factory gave Amelia a small 2-room flat with a pass-through room and a small kitchen. But Amelia and her mother were happy about it. Albert will go to school, and he'll have his own room, Mrs. Anna said proudly. And you and me, my daughter, will share a room. And if you have to get married, I won't get in your way. I'll go back to the village. No, Amelia shook her head. I'm not going to get married. What if a father who isn't my own starts hurting my little boy? And what do I need a husband for? It's only trouble. After a while, Mrs. Anna suddenly began to complain of pain in her heart, although she had no problems with it before. And her blood pressure was constantly rising. And no medication helped. Doctors helplessly waved their hands and advised to change the climate for a while. After consulting Amelia, Mrs. Anna decided to go to her village for a couple of months to live in peace and quiet, not in the hustle and bustle of the city. Albert was already in kindergarten, and Amelia had to transfer to another shop to work only the day shift. In the village, Mrs. Anna came alive, even managed to make a few beds. In the vegetable garden, carrots and turnips, vitamins for Albert, she said. One morning, a neighbor came to her house, brought a can of steamed milk, and saw Mrs. Anna lying on the floor. The neighbor started calling for help, but it was too late. Mrs. Anna had been dead for a couple of hours. Amelia took a long time to get over her mother's death and blamed herself for letting the sick woman go alone to the village. But life went on. In addition, Albert demanded attention, and Amelia's heartache at losing her mother began to subside a little. Soon she sold her parents' house in the village. With this money, she made some repairs in the flat and renewed the furniture in the room of her son, who was soon to go to the 1st grade. Again, Amelia worked hard. In addition to her main job at the factory, in the evening she washed the entrances to the house. She needed money, which she spent without regret on her son Albert. He had everything he wanted: an expensive football, toys, table hockey. Amelia tried to make sure that the boy, who was growing up without a father, did not need anything. When returning from work, Amelia always went to the shop and bought Albert sweets. She bought fruit for him exclusively at the market, as well as cottage cheese, meat, and fish. There were times when wages were delayed at the factory and there was only money left in her purse for traveling. Even then, Amelia managed to feed her son something tasty, inventing her own recipes and using what she could find in the fridge. She herself might not eat it all these days, or she would wait for what Albert left on his plate. The most important thing for her was that her son never went hungry. She looked at her son fondly when he ate, and she didn't even worry that she would be left without lunch at work tomorrow. She did her best: malnutrition, lack of sleep. She was very tired, working 2 and sometimes 3 jobs. But she never complained, because she did it all for the sake of her favorite son Albert. Albert himself did not cause his mother much trouble. He studied well at school, played sports, and attended an aeromodeling club. Amelia was proud of her son and blushed with embarrassment when he was praised at parents' meetings for participating in sports events or helping to clean up the school grounds. When he was in high school, Albert began to work part-time himself, cleaning entrances to help his mother. He was shy, but he never refused to unload goods in a shop or help someone carry heavy things. He always used the proceeds to buy his mother her favorite Palanca sponge cake, or they would go to an ice cream parlor together and Albert would pay for it himself, proudly taking the money out of his pocket. Amelia was happy to have such an attentive and caring son, telling everyone she knew about him. After graduating from high school, Albert enrolled at the Polytechnic University. He wanted to apply to a construction technical school, but his mother Amelia insisted that he must have a higher education, which no one in their family had ever had. After classes, Albert worked part-time again, either as a loader in a warehouse or as a waiter in a cafe. Amelia now did not clean the entrances, and at the factory she moved to the receiving department, because after a long time working at the machine, her legs were very sore. All in all, they were doing well. The only thing that upset Amelia was that Albert would not introduce her to any girl and did not want to marry her. And Amelia wanted to have grandchildren. "Mum, why should I get married?" he said, laughing. "I'm fine as I am. Who else will take care of me like you?" And I have nothing to offer a girl my own flat, no car too. And I don't make much money yet. Not many people would go for that. But you're handsome and clever. Amelia looked at her son with love. The rest is a matter of time. What do you need a flat for? You can live here. There's plenty of room for everyone. And when I die, you'll be the masters of the whole place. No, Mum, I don't want to. Albert shook his head. You and I are good together. After the institute, Albert got a job. From time to time, he met one girl or the other, but he did not start any serious relationships. Everything changed when he met Linda, a tall, blue-eyed beauty with long blonde hair. They met at a birthday party at a mutual friend's house and left together. Albert walked the girl to her house, agreeing that they would see each other again in a few days. Linda was 4 years younger than Albert, had also graduated from university and worked as a marketer in a trading company. She talked interestingly about the countries she had traveled to and her work. Linda was so light and cheerful that she literally turned Albert's head. They had already been dating for 6 months, when Albert decided to introduce Linda to his mother. Mum, I finally met the girl of my dreams and I want you to meet her, he announced one evening. Oh son, I'm so glad. Amelia splashed her hands. We must set the table. I'll bake pies with cabbage and potatoes as you like. What is your girlfriend like? Linda doesn't eat anything sweet or flowery, Albert grinned. She's on a diet to keep her figure. So don't cook anything. We'll just have tea. I'll buy a low-fat cake myself. It's not very human, Amelia shrugged. A new person comes into the house, and we can't even give them a proper meal. Don't worry, Mum. Albert put his arm round Amelia's shoulders. The main thing for me is that you like each other. I'll like any girl you like, son. Amelia stroked her son's head. The main thing is that she loves you. And you love her too. I want you to be happy. But no matter what Amelia said, she didn't like Linda. She's a tricky one, she said to herself as Albert left to walk Linda home. She smiles sweetly, but her eyes are evil. Oh, this new fashion. A slice of cake and a cup of tea, that's all the treat. But it was evident that Albert loved her, and that was important. I'll get used to her somehow, Amelia decided. My grandmother used to say a hen pecking at a grain. She keeps the whole yard in her memory. Mum, what do you think of Linda? Albert asked excitedly when he got home. Isn't she beautiful? She's beautiful, Amelia agreed, nodding her head. But she's very thin. What keeps her soul alive? Do you love her? Very much. Albert averted his eyes in embarrassment. And I want her to be my wife. Now it's time for you to marry, Amelia smiled. Well, son, so be it. They decided to have the wedding in 3 months, so that they would have time to prepare for it. Albert told Linda at once that they would live with his mum. You see, Linda, he said, we have no extra money for rented accommodation. We'll have to spend a lot of money on the wedding. And I've already bought the honeymoon vouchers. In the meantime, we'll live with my mum in a separate room, save money for the down payment, and take a mortgage on the flat. My mum's very nice. I think you'll get along with her. Of course, my love, Linda replied gently. You're absolutely right. Why pay money to strangers when you have somewhere to live? We'll be patient for a while, but then we'll move into a bigger and more spacious flat. Linda answered in a way that made Albert like her even more. She had not thought about a future life with her mother-in-law. She knew the saying, patience and hard work will get you through it. The wedding was celebrated in a restaurant. The bride's parents insisted on it. Amelia was uncomfortable. She had never been to such a place. Every now and then she was adjusting the new dress she had bought for the celebration. And when she sat down at the table, she took off her shoes with a small heel, which stung, but were very beautiful and matched the dress. Through tears, she looked at her grown son in his dark blue suit and white flower in his buttonhole. She was proud that she alone had managed to raise such a handsome boy, who might soon become a father himself. And she, Amelia, would have long awaited grandchildren. Linda was also very pretty. In a snow-white long dress, she looked like a porcelain statue. The guests kept shouting. Bitter, the bride and groom rose from their seats and kissed embarrassedly. And I've never had a wedding, And I've never worn a white dress either, Amelia suddenly thought. But she immediately dismissed the thought. What's there to be jealous of? She was angry with herself. You should be happy. My only son is getting married. My pride and support in my old age. The bride's parents said that the wedding should be celebrated in half. We realize, of course, that you're on a tight budget, Miranda said when they met Amelia before the wedding. We're not rich either, but we do value our only children, so we don't have to make a mess of it in front of the guests. Amelia didn't know what rich people were and tried to object. We don't have many guests on our side. No relatives. Albert will invite a few of his mates from school and work. That's all. It doesn't matter, Miranda said. Just be thankful we're not making you buy the bride's outfit. Like we used to? Believe me, it's not cheap. Laura picked out a dress at the salon for her. She named the cost of the dress. A price that made Amelia gasp. Well, Miranda continued, we're not going to skimp on our own daughter. A wedding is a once-in-a-lifetime event. Well, maybe 2, she thought. 3 at the most. So we need the bride to be the most beautiful. Amelia withdrew all the money from her book, which wasn't much. She borrowed the rest from acquaintances, which she paid back for a year, limiting herself in many things. She had no money for a present for the young people. She remembered that her mother had given her gold earrings with red stones, so she decided to give them to her daughter-in-law. Linda fiddled with the earrings. She wrinkled her nose, but thanked her mother-in-law and gave the earrings to her mother, who immediately hid them in her purse. Immediately after the wedding, Albert and Linda left for their honeymoon, and Amelia began to organize their room. She washed the window, changed the curtains, and made the bed with new linen. She put a small rug on the floor. Good, she sighed with satisfaction as she looked into the room. When Linda and Albert get back, we'll be a family. Fie, what are those curtains? Linda was outraged when she entered the room. It's like the country. Well, of course they are. Amelia was confused. I bought them a long time ago, but I kept saving them, regretting such a beauty. So the curtains had to come in handy. The room became cozier at once. What's this? Linda saw a rug on the floor. It's very rustic. Do you want to make our room into a rustic hut for Albert and me? Mum, really? Albert supported her. We'll sort it out ourselves. Do as you please, Amelia took offense and left the room. From the open door, she could hear Linda's continued outrage and Albert's affectionate reassurance. In the kitchen, Linda also immediately put her own order. The bottom shelf in the fridge is yours. Put your food there, and we'll put it on the middle and top shelves. We'll eat separately because I'm on a diet. I'm cooking everything low-fat. It's time for Albert to start thinking about his health. Linda brought some nice crockery from her parents, pots and pans, a small frying pan. There was only room for Amelia in one narrow cupboard, 2 pots, a couple of plates, a cup and a few other kitchen utensils. Linda packed everything else into a large bag and took it to the rubbish bin. Why do you keep all this stuff? She was indignant again. Gold-rimmed mugs, 3 plates, bent spoons. Who needs it? My mother brought it from the village, she answered timidly. How could I get rid of it? There are so many beautiful sets for sale. Linda sighed. And you can't get rid of a rustic. Linda continued to tidy up the flat, which had been literally transformed. In her and Albert's room, there was a new sofa and a small wardrobe. There were blinds on the windows and a plasma TV on the wall opposite the sofa. In the bathroom, Albert had installed shelves on which stood jars of creams, shampoo, and other feminine products that Amelia didn't understand. Son, she asked Albert when Linda wasn't home, did you get a bonus or something? If you bought such a marvelous thing, she pointed to the automatic washing machine. It must be expensive. Mum, Albert laughed. Now you can buy everything on credit. What do you mean? Amelia looked at her son in bewilderment. It's like this: first you buy a thing, and then you pay for it gradually, Albert explained. Everybody lives like that nowadays, and you don't have to save up for years to buy something you need. I'm planning to buy a car that way too, and I'm paying off the TV here, and then I'll take out a new loan. Unless Linda needs a fur coat, he laughed. When do you plan to have children? Amelia asked Albert. Later, Albert said. We want to live for ourselves first, to see the world. And it will be difficult to do that with children. We'll have to spend a lot of money on nappies and nappy covers. Sometimes Linda's friends came to visit. They'd sit in the kitchen for long periods of time, smoking. It gave Amelia a headache and she couldn't sleep all night. But she didn't say anything to her son or daughter-in-law. What are the young ones to do? Old age will come, and you won't want to socialize with anyone. Twice a year, Linda and Albert went on holiday. And then Amelia felt like a full-fledged mistress in the flat. She could sit at the table in the kitchen for long periods of time, watch television, cook leisurely, standing at the cooker. And most importantly, she enjoyed the silence. No one walked back and forth across her room, and she could sleep well at night. When Amelia retired a few years later, it became even more difficult to live in the flat. Linda wasn't working by then either. She had quit her old job and was looking for a new one. But she was in no hurry to get a new job. But she was always reproaching Albert for not earning enough money. Linda slept until lunchtime, during which time Amelia had time to eat breakfast and prepare her own food, so that she would not disturb her daughter-in-law in the kitchen. Linda liked to sit at the table for a long time with one foot on the chair, take her time drinking coffee, smoking 1 or 2 cigarettes, and looking out of the window somewhere in the distance. Amelia tried to get out of the house by this time, whatever the weather. Amelia would walk down the street, going into shops to keep warm or to hide from the rain. She would return towards evening when Albert came home from work. She felt more at ease with him. Late at night, when they went to their room and switched on the television, Amelia couldn't sleep well, waking up to any noise, Albert going to the toilet, Linda needing to get a glass of water from the kitchen. When Amelia found out that Linda was pregnant, she was overjoyed. Finally, after 5 years, she would have a grandson or granddaughter. She began to imagine walking down the avenue with a pram, looking at the sleeping baby. But what she heard shattered all her dreams. So I'm not wanted here, she got up from the sofa and walked to the window, where it was already dark. Well, she sighed heavily, they have their own family, and I'll live somehow. How much of that life is left? In the morning, when Albert had gone to work, Amelia took out a checkered notebook from her bedside table, tore out a piece of paper and began to write something. She didn't go out for a walk as usual that day, and didn't mind that an irritated Linda was pacing around the flat and even dropped a stool in the kitchen a few times, kicking it with her foot. In the evening, when Albert came home, Amelia came into the kitchen and sat down across from him. "Son, I need to talk to you," she said. "What's wrong, Mum?" Albert looked at her anxiously. "Is it something serious?" "You see, son, it's like this." Amelia was silent for a while. "I have to go away, probably for a long time." "Why?" Where to? Albert wondered. "I got a letter from Aunt Gwen today." Amelia took a small piece of paper out of her pocket and showed it to Albert, but did not hand it to him. "Well, do you remember Aunt Gwen, your grandmother's cousin?" "How would you remember her? When we went to the village, you were very young." "Aunt Gwen says she's ill and needs help," Amelia said quickly, so that her son wouldn't understand. "She has no family left and no one to look after her. So Aunt Gwen asked me to look after her, and in return she'll give me the deed to her house. It's a good house. It'll last 100 years. Then you can sell it, add some money, and buy you a flat." Albert stretched out. "Well, if you have to, go. But let's leave at the weekend so I can walk you to the bus." No, Amelia waved her hands fearfully. "I'll go tomorrow. Aunt Gwen writes to tell me to leave right away. I don't know how long the letter has been traveling. It might be too late. Don't worry. I haven't got much. Why don't Linda at least come with you?" Albert offered tentatively. "What's the matter, son?" She waved her hand again. "Linda is in such a state now that she needs to take care of herself. Don't worry, I'll get there myself." "How's that?" "You know," Albert got up from the table. "Will you be back in time for the birth of our child?" I don't know. Amelia shook her head. "I'm not going to guess. I don't know how things will turn out. Maybe I'll live there and stay there for good. So you can use the flat as you see fit, move into the big room. And you can make a nursery in the small one. Well, it's up to you. We'll figure it out. Albert left the kitchen and went into the room, where Linda's joyful voice could be heard. Amelia tore up the letter she had written to herself that morning and threw it in the rubbish bin. Then she went back to her room, opened the wardrobe and started pulling out her things, putting them into a small traveling bag. Almost 3 years had passed. Albert and Linda's family life was not going well. She reproached her husband for not devoting time to her or their little daughter. Albert replied that he worked 2 jobs so that the family did not need anything, because Linda's needs were growing more and more every day. And it was taking a lot of money for the baby. Over time, Albert realized that he probably didn't really love Linda, but was just fascinated by her beauty and attractiveness. And now it was as if a veil had fallen from his eyes. Linda turned out to be a very scandalous wife. She wanted Albert to help her around the house and earn a lot. He did not refuse to help his wife, coming back from work, bringing groceries. On rare weekends, he cleaned the flat and cooked meals. But he resented the fact that Linda sat all day on the phone, texting with girlfriends or ordering some things through an online shop. She did not do much with her daughter, who fortunately grew up a very quiet child and could play with toys on her own, without causing her mother much trouble. In addition, Albert was very offended at his wife for naming the newborn girl Angelina without consulting him. What kind of name is that? Albert was outraged at the time. I thought we were going to name our daughter Iris or Joyce or maybe Laura. Phew, Linda replied, embarrassed. Iris, Joyce. It's like the countryside, but Angelina. It's trendy and modern. Linda was supported by her mother-in-law. And Albert waved his hand. Call it what you like. Only his father-in-law sided with him. They'll call the girl Oliver Laughed, like a cow in an advert. The family was always short of money. Instead of saving a little, Linda ordered cosmetics and clothes she hardly ever wore. The wardrobe was full of her stuff. Those cosmetics were still in her nightstand drawer. Stop wasting money. Albert once told his wife, "We'll never save for our own flat." Why do we need a flat? Linda wondered. We're doing fine here for now. When Angelina grows up a little more, we'll exchange this flat for a bigger place. What do you mean? Albert looked at her in confusion. Actually, my mom is also registered here. She's gone to the country for a while. She can come back at any moment. This is already our flat. Linda looked at her husband angrily. Look, she circled the room with her hand. Where are we going to put your mom? And anyway, if she hasn't come here for so many years, she won't come back now. Albert thought about it. He hadn't heard from his mom in 3 years. He had never even visited her in the village. He decided that he would have to go there next weekend to see how she was doing. Maybe she needs some help. But soon Albert forgot about his promise. He got busy at work and had another fight with Linda. Or rather, they fought every night now. He hardly got home, and his mother-in-law was adding fuel to the fire. Other husbands to their wives and buy fur coats. And take to resorts, she said with a complaint son-in-law. And you in life, even a gold ring, cannot give a gift, which she has long dreamed of. So let her find a husband who will provide her with everything. Albert snapped back. Since I'm so bad. And she will nod at the mother-in-law. A beautiful girl like my daughter will never be left alone. She deserves the best. So let her go to the best. Albert couldn't stand it one day when his mother-in-law again reproached him for not earning enough money. I won't cry. Might as well pack my things now and get out of here. That's right. The mother-in-law proudly raised her head and turned to her daughter. Linda, get ready. We're not staying in this flat with this worthless man for another minute. Linda defiantly started to take things out of the wardrobe and put them into a large bag. Albert watched silently. We'll take the baby with us. Too, the mother-in-law began to stuff toys into the bag. My dear Angelina, your father is worthless. If he can't provide not only for his wife but also for his child. Take it. Albert shrugged indifferently. Nobody will forbid me to see my daughter anyway. We'll see about that. The mother-in-law grabbed her granddaughter by the hand and pulled her into the hallway. Linda followed them, dragging her bag. Don't forget to leave the keys to the flat, Albert reminded her. Choke on it. Linda took the keys out of her purse and threw them at her husband. You'll be sorry, but it'll be too late. Yeah, Albert nodded and slammed the door behind them. Linda cried in the taxi. Mum, maybe I shouldn't have left Albert. No way, said her mother firmly. Let him suffer. You'll see he'll come to you on his knees and beg for forgiveness. But don't be a fool and forgive him at once. Let him buy you a ring and a mink fur coat, which you have long dreamed of. That's true, Linda wiped her tears. Let him suffer, and I'll think about whether to forgive him or not. Sweet Angelina sat between her grandmother and mother and didn't understand what was happening. She was very sad that they had left her daddy, whom she loved very much. Albert did not show up at her mother-in-law's and father-in-law's flat the next day or a week later. There was also no call from him on his wife's phone. Should I call him myself? Linda asked her mom anxiously. Don't you dare. Miranda looked at her daughter angrily. He'll think you're humiliating yourself in front of him, and he'll stop appreciating you. Let's wait a little longer. Albert, meanwhile, felt almost happy. He missed his daughter, but at the same time he enjoyed his bachelor life. He was happy to come home after work, where no one reproached him or made scandals. Albert also realized that he missed his mother, her gentle voice, her care, her hard and yet soft hands. He lay awake all night remembering how he and his mother had gone to a cafe to eat ice cream, and how they had ridden on a merry-go-round in the park, and his mother had clutched her son's hand tightly out of fear. He remembered her fragrant pancakes, delicious pancakes, his favorite potato pies. The next day Albert took a day off work and went to the railway station. When he reached the village, he got out and looked around confused. He didn't know where to go next. He couldn't remember the house where Aunt Gwen and now Mum lived. So he decided to ask the first person he saw for directions. Excuse me, please, he said to the postman, who was just delivering his pension. I need to find a house. Only I don't know the landlady's surname. Her name is Gwen, and my mum Amelia lives with her now. You must know her. You probably bring her a pension too, don't you? I don't remember her, grumbled the postman. There used to be a Mrs. Anna Robinson. She went to the city to see her daughter, and then she came back here and died. Her house has long since been sold. So that's my grandmother. Albert rejoiced. She had a cousin, Aunt Gwen, whom my mother came to look after. Oh, I remember, the postman nodded. You must be talking about Gwen Hopkins. Albert nodded uncertainly. She's been dead about 7 years since she was buried. Who did my mum go to then? Albert looked at the woman, perplexed. I don't know, my dear, I don't know. The postman shrugged his shoulders and threw his bag from one shoulder to the other. I've never seen her. Gwen's house is over there, she pointed to the end of the street, behind the green fence. You'll recognize it. Albert followed the direction and soon found himself standing next to a ramshackle house with a hole in the roof and a rotten porch. Mum, he covered his face with his hands. Where am I going to find you now? He remembered that when his mother had read him the letter, supposedly from Aunt Gwen, her hands had trembled and she had tried not to look at her son, hiding the tears in her eyes. And she had taken very few things with her, and Linda had thrown the rest in the rubbish bin. How could I not have realized that Mum just didn't want to disturb us? Albert slapped his hand on his forehead. She'd spent her whole life trying to make me feel good, and I, the fool, hadn't appreciated it. Back in town, Albert thought about how he could find his mother. The first thing he did was to go to the police and file a missing persons report. They advised him to go to a home for the elderly. Could Amelia be there? So Albert, without delay, went straight to the address. The home for the elderly, called Hope, was not far from the city. Can you tell me, he said to the pretty woman in uniform who was sitting at the desk, going through some papers, is Amelia Robinson in your care? Robinson, the woman said thoughtfully. Let me see. She began flipping through the lists of residents and shook her head in the negative. No, we don't have her listed. Who does she look like to you? That's my mum. Albert lowered his head. She lied to me when she said she had gone to the village to look after her aunt. I went to the village yesterday. Mum didn't even show up there. Now I don't know where to find her. I had hoped she lived here. He sighed heavily. Alas, my hopes were not fulfilled. So I'll keep looking until I find her. Why did she deceive you? The woman looked at Albert with interest. What did you do? I turned out to be a soulless son. He inclined his head even lower. And now I want to make up for that mistake. Oh, if you knew how many old people live in our house who have been abandoned by their children, the woman sighed. Everyone has a story to tell. Take Mrs. Anna Smith, who was brought to us after being picked up off the street. She'd been wandering round the town for days, sleeping at the railway station. The old woman said she'd lost her memory. She just called herself Anna, but she could not remember her surname or address where she lived, no matter how they questioned her. She didn't have any ID on her. We'd already given her the name Smith, as well as another name. When she was registered with us, we couldn't even find her relatives, the woman continued. We don't know her real name or date of birth. She doesn't even receive a pension. We collected clothes for her, as they say, with the whole world, because she came to us with one small purse, which contained almost nothing, not even documents. When she had a bad cold, she repeated only the name Albert in her delirium. We thought it was her son, who must have kicked his mother out of the house when she lost her memory. Albert suddenly remembered that he had found his mum's passport when he was sorting out his papers. So she didn't take it or forgot to put it in her bag. And the name Anna made me suspicious. That was my grandmother's name. Is this old woman alive? He asked cautiously. Can I see her? Well, the woman rose from her seat. Come on, I'll show her to you. Albert recognized the old woman sitting on the bed as his mother, who had aged and lost even more weight. Mum, he called softly. Amelia flinched and turned round. Albert, my son, she exclaimed, unable to believe her eyes. Mummy, I'm sorry. Albert fell on his knees in front of her and cried. I am so guilty before you. Calm down, my darling. Amelia stroked his head with her wrinkled hand. I knew I would see you again. I believed you'd find me. Mum, come on, let's go home. You're not staying here anymore? Home? Amelia looked at her son confused. But I'll be in the way of everything. I'd rather stay here and you can visit me often. You won't bother anyone, Albert assured her. I live alone. I'm preparing for a divorce. I don't want such a wife. We'll live with you again, just the two of us. And sometimes Angelina will come to visit us. Is that your new fiancé? Amelia looked angrily at her son. Angelina is my daughter, he laughed, and your granddaughter, whom you must meet. Albert asked. I have a granddaughter? Amelia was now crying with happiness. Yes, Albert, you do. Amelia fussed. I'll pack quickly and we'll go home. I don't have much stuff, but I have enough. Thank you to the kind people who gave me everything I need. And thank them for not leaving me to die in the street. When Amelia entered her room, she stopped on the threshold, hesitating to go any further. Mum, what are you doing? Albert was surprised. Come in. You're the rightful owner of this place now. I didn't think I'd ever come back here again, she said, looking round. Maybe I should go back to the old people's home. Amelia looked anxiously at her son. Would you make up with Linda and move on with your life? You have a daughter growing up. How will she be without her father? I'll see my daughter, but I won't live with Linda anymore, Albert said. Let's not bring it up again. Come on, I'd better show you your room. He took his mother to the room where Angelina used to live. Now you'll live here and no one will bother you. What about you, son? Amelia got worried. Will you be uncomfortable in a passageway room? What if I have to go to the loo in the middle of the night? I'll go and wake you up. You won't? Albert laughed. I sleep so soundly that a tank will pass by and I won't hear it. Come on, Mum. Make yourself comfortable. And tomorrow you and I will go to the shop to buy you clothes and anything else you need. I'll cook something. You and I are going to eat. And you're going to tell me how you've lived all these years. Albert was just finishing frying potatoes when his phone rang. Linda appeared on the screen. He wrinkled his nose and didn't answer the call. The phone rang again and again. Albert even had to switch it off so it wouldn't interfere with his communication with his mom. After about an hour, someone rang the doorbell. Who the hell is that? Albert grumbled as he clicked the lock. Linda stood on the doorstep. Why don't you answer my calls and messages? She asked indignantly. Do you want me to resent you even more? She pushed Albert away and walked into the hallway. If you apologize to me now, then so be it. Linda looked condescendingly at her husband. I will forgive you, but for the last time. If it happens again, you will never see me again. I don't want to see you now, Albert replied calmly. Why did you come here? Linda noticed her mother-in-law, who came out of her room. What is that one doing in our flat? She pointed at Amelia. That's my mom, Albert frowned. And now she's going to live here with me. And you don't belong here anymore. Go away. He waved his hand towards the door. You have nothing to do with this flat. Then you'll never see our daughter again, Linda used the last argument. I'll terminate your paternity. We'll talk about it in court. Albert was unfazed. No one can stop me from having contact with my child, so calm down and leave. I'll file for divorce myself so you don't have to bother. Albert, Linda suddenly cried, why don't we try to start over? If you want, we can move in with my parents, or rent a flat. Let your mom live here. I'm sorry, but I don't love you anymore, Albert shook his head. And you probably don't love me either. What's the point of having a family like this? Can I at least take the rest of my things? Her voice trembled with excitement. I don't mind. Take it, he allowed. Just hurry up. Mum's tired, and it's time for her to rest. Without saying hello to her mother-in-law, Linda quickly packed everything she needed into bags and went out the door. Son, maybe you shouldn't do that to Linda? Amelia asked cautiously. I don't know what's wrong, said Amelia. There's no such thing as a husband and wife. They had a fight. They make up. No, Mum, I can't do that, Albert shook his head. Remember how Grandma used to say there's heaven in a cage with a sweetheart, so I want to live in love and harmony. And who else but you, Mum, would love me so sincerely and completely unselfishly? You've always loved me more than anyone else in the world. And now I have to take care of you. I'm the happiest man in the world because I have you, Mum. Madison was waiting for her husband to come home from work, cooking dinner. But when she opened the door, she was heartbroken to see ... me for. Madison was in the kitchen cooking dinner. She was enjoying what she called family time. Madison, when are we having dinner? Looking into the kitchen, asked Richard, the girl's fiancé. A couple more minutes and everything will be ready. Madison smiled. I can't wait, the young man muttered. He sat down at the table and watched the bride's manipulations. If someone had helped me a little, we would have had dinner a long time ago, Madison jokingly told him. What are you implying? Richard was indignant. Nothing, she stroked the young man's hair. I was just saying that if you had helped me in the beginning, everything would have been ready long ago. I'm not just sitting at home, by the way, Richard pouted. I'm developing a cool program that will cost a lot of money. That's why I don't have time to do housework. And that's the kind of thing a girl should be doing. I know, honey, Madison kissed her fiancé on the cheek. At that moment, the doorbell rang. Who the hell is this? Richard asked in surprise. You know I don't have the gift of foresight, she joked. But when she met her fiancé's stern gaze, her playful mood disappeared. I'll get it, Richard said grudgingly and left the table. It so happened that the young man was by nature an introvert, and uninvited guests were like a bone in his throat. When Richard opened the door, he was startled. Standing before him was his cousin Oswald. Richard, hello, he said loudly, entering the flat uninvited. Oswald, Richard asked, confused. Brother, why are you looking at me like that? It's like seeing a ghost." Oswald laughed. "Or are you not happy to see me?" "Of course I am, but..." Richard tried to collect his thoughts. "What are you doing here?" "I decided to move to the city," shrugged his shoulders. "I'm tired of dealing with my own affairs in the village. I want to find a job here, and then a bride." I see Richard scratched his head. At that moment, the landlady came out into the corridor. When she saw the guest, she smiled broadly. "Oswald, what a surprise." Madison hugged the young man. "What are you doing here?" "I decided to move to the city," answered the guest. "Oswald, you're just in time. We were just about to have dinner." The girl invited everyone to the table. The evening passed in a relaxed atmosphere. Even Richard, who was not particularly happy about his brother's arrival, got involved in the conversation. Grandpa Travis had caught up with his cow. Oswald finished his story. "Yes, as long as I can remember, Grandpa Travis always had adventures," Richard said. "On the one hand, I love the country," Madison said dreamily. "What's good about it?" Richard wondered. "There's something romantic about it," she smiled enigmatically. The groom looked at his bride with all his eyes. The young man was a city dweller to the core and never understood the romance of the countryside. Nights under the moon, dew on daisies, evening sunsets near the river. A lot, you know. Madison started listing. "Oof," Richard pointed at his fiancée. "And meanwhile, Madison is right," supported Oswald girl. "You can't find that in the city." "All right, brother, it's late," Richard said gruffly. "Where are you staying?" "I'm nowhere." The guest was confused. "What do you mean?" Richard was taken aback. "I thought I'd stay with you for a while." "I'm looking for a job." Oswald shrugged his shoulders. "So to speak, on a kinship basis. Brother, in your village you can come to visit and stay overnight for a few days," Richard grinned. "But in the city you have to give advance notice of your arrival." "Where am I supposed to go now?" Oswald asked. He was disappointed by his brother's inhospitality. "Richard, it's late tonight, and Oswald can stay with us," said Madison. "And tomorrow morning we will look for a suitable option for him." "I have one more question for you." Oswald looked at his brother carefully. "When can you pay me back my debt?" "What debt?" The girl was surprised. "I borrowed money from Oswald more than a year ago to develop a program," Richard explained in a disgruntled tone. "What program?" Madison squinted her eyes and stared at her fiancé. "Isn't it the super program you're still writing? Yes?" Richard nodded his head. "I see," Madison said, confused. The girl was discouraged. Richard had initially lied to her, saying that it was a program commissioned by a large company. In fact, it turns out that he borrowed the money from his brother a year ago. Now, there are two questions: where to get the money to pay back the debt and how to live on. The next morning, Richard woke up in a bad mood. The arrival of his brother has disturbed his mental equilibrium. Spoilt relations with his fiancée last night because of Oswald's long tongue. Richard had a fight with Madison. "Tell me, why did you have to lie to me about your super program?" The girl was indignant. "I didn't lie. I just didn't tell the whole truth," Richard justified himself. "How are you going to pay back the debt?" Madison didn't back down. "I'll sell the program and pay it off." "When will you sell it?" "When I write it," Richard snapped. "And if that never happens?" the girl asked. "Thank you very much." The young man bowed to Madison, then grinned and said wryly, "I always knew you'd be there for me in a time of need." "I'm just realistic about things." The girl looked intently into his eyes. "There is a debt to be repaid." "I'll pay back the money." Richard got angry. "When and why will you pay it back?" "Why are you bothering me?" The young man was indignant. "Because I don't want to start my family life with lies and debts," Madison replied. "Then no one's keeping you," Richard blurted out. "The door is open 24 hours a day. And if you're so mercenary, you're on your own from now on." "About the door, I'll think about your offer, especially since it's my flat," she said in a serious tone. And about the separate budget, I agree with you completely. From tomorrow, everyone pays for his own food, utilities, and his own wants. Madison got into bed and turned away from her fiancé. "You're welcome," Richard muttered. He was hurt that his fiancé hadn't supported him in his hour of need, but instead had sided with his brother. Memories of last night's quarrel made Richard's mood even worse. Suddenly, a sound from the kitchen alerted the young man. Richard listened. Madison was laughing merrily at Oswald's jokes. This was the last thing he needed. Richard stood up quickly and dressed. "What's going on here?" Richard stood up quickly and dressed. "What's going on here?" Madison, who had been laughing, turned away from her fiancé. She silently collected the rest of the breakfast and put it in the fridge. "Madison, why did you do that?" Oswald wondered. "And to feed Richard breakfast. Why is your brother armless?" Madison asked snidely. "Well, I ran to work, or who will support me?" The girl walked past Richard without even looking at him. A couple of minutes later, the young men heard the sound of a door slamming shut. "Yes, brother, you've caused me a lot of trouble," Richard accused Oswald. "I'm sorry, I didn't know you hadn't told me anything about your fiancé." "About your duty," the young man said. "I'm sorry," Richard mumbled in reply. "Well, that's it," Oswald said, getting up from the table. "I'm off." "Where are you going?" surprised Richard. "Where to? To look for a job? I can't sit on your neck." "All right then," Richard rejoiced. "The sooner Oswald finds a job, the sooner he'll move out. Good luck to you." After breakfast, Richard sat down to write the program. He switched on the computer, but he still couldn't write a single line. The young man's thoughts kept returning to Madison. No doubt he loved his fiancée, but he was hurt by her lack of confidence in his abilities. Toward evening, Madison and Oswald returned home. The girl immediately went into the kitchen to prepare dinner without even looking at Richard. "Why are you two together?" Richard asked unhappily. He was tormented by jealousy. "I met Madison at the entrance and helped her lift the heavy bags," Oswald explained. "By the way, brother, could you pick up your fiancé from work? You would go to the shop together and buy groceries, so that the girl would not carry heavy bags," Oswald suggested. "We'll sort it out ourselves," Richard muttered. "And why are you always meddling in the wrong business?" "I was just trying to help." Oswald waved his hands. "By the way, I have good news. I found a job at a computer firm." "Thank God," Richard rejoiced. "But that's not all," smiled the guest. "I've made a deal for you, so you'll be starting next week too." "As what?" Richard was stunned. "Who's what?" Oswald smiled even wider. "Software and hardware engineer. You're a computer scientist by God." "Did I ask you to do that?" Richard asked angrily. "Why do you always meddle where you are not asked?" "I just wanted to help," Oswald explained. "Go you know where with your help?" shouted Richard. "I am so sick of you. Get out of my flat and out of my life, so that my eyes do not see you." At Richard's screams, a frightened Madison ran out of the kitchen. "What's going on in here?" asked the girl. "I found a job for Richard, and he started." Oswald began to explain the situation, but Richard interrupted him. "I told you to stay out of my life." The anger inside Richard just tore him apart. "Brother, you'd better calm down before you have a stroke," Oswald advised in a calm tone, which made Richard even angrier. Richard wanted to attack his brother with his fists, but he was stopped by Madison's shout. "Calm down quickly." The girl clenched her fists in anger. "Richard, have you lost your mind?" He started at first, Richard complained, pouting his lips. "You should thank your brother for taking care of you." Madison shamed her fiancé. "And you're throwing your fists at him." "Don't mind your own business," she said in a quiet, commanding tone. "All right, now we'll all go to dinner, and afterwards we'll talk and discuss everything." "I'm not going to sit at the same table with him," Richard said in a cranky tone. "You can stay hungry." Madison shrugged indifferently. "It's up to you." Richard had no choice but to accept his fiancée's proposal. The conversation at dinner flowed smoothly. The young men were reluctant to utter words, each thinking about his own. After dinner, all three sat down in the living room. "Now, Richard, it's up to you, of course. But today we have utility bills to pay," Madison said sternly. "Following your suggestion from yesterday, we'll split everything in half." The girl held out the receipts to her fiancé. "Familiarize yourself with what we owe for, and how much we owe. All bills must be paid by the 25th, she said. "Where will I get the money?" Richard was surprised. "Your problem." Madison shrugged indifferently. "But all payments are due on time." "Richard, I'm going to tell you something. Just don't shout," carefully began Oswald. When the young man made sure that his brother listened to him attentively, he continued. "What prevents you from combining work and writing a program? Do you think it's easy?" Richard was indignant. "Not easy," agreed the guest. "But with your brains you can do it." "At least you believe in me," Richard said with a sneer and looked at his fiancée. "Don't look at Madison like a wolf," Oswald advised. "Understand, she is a young girl. She wants a new dress and lipstick. So let her buy it." Richard shrugged his shoulders. "Who forbids her?" "And with what money did you think?" The guest looked at his brother carefully. "All her salary goes to your needs, while you're pretending to be a great genius." Richard opened his mouth to object, but didn't make a sound. Damn it, Oswald was right. "Madison, why did you put up with me for so long?" Richard asked, dumbfounded. "Long ago you should have kicked me to speed up, so that I found a job." "Because I love you," the girl replied quietly. Richard walked over to the girl and hugged her tightly. "Forgive me, please," whispered the young man. "My ambition closed my eyes to reality." "That's right," Madison said. Tears sprang from her eyes. "Has the armor of ambition and arrogance of a great genius cracked?" "I swear I'll work hard to make sure you have everything you want," Richard vowed and kissed his bride. "And I'll see to it," smiled satisfied Oswald. Happy Madison looked at her guest and whispered, "Thank you." 3 months passed. Richard and his brother worked in a computer firm. Oswald moved into a rented flat. Madison and her fiancé's life began to slowly return to normal. One evening after work, the girl waited for her beloved from work. Today she had a surprise for him. Madison was pregnant. The girl was finishing cooking dinner. The doorbell rang. "Honey, did you forget your keys?" Madison asked, opening the door. But it wasn't her fiancé standing in front of her. "Hello, are you Richard's fiancé?" asked a beautiful girl and smiled sweetly. Yes, Madison was confused. "I need to have a serious talk with you," the guest replied and entered the flat. "About what?" "The thing is, Richard and I are in love." Madison was speechless at what she heard. How is that possible? Did her Richard have another girlfriend? But how could that be? After all, her fiancé, he loved her every day when he came home from work. He never once gave her any reason to doubt his fidelity. Yes, Richard is no angel, but to live on 2 fronts. "Who are you?" Madison asked with difficulty. Her throat was sharply dry, and her tongue refused to listen. "My name is Chris," the girl replied arrogantly. She looked Madison over from head to toe with an appraising gaze. "And I'm Richard's new love." "But how can that be?" The landlady mumbled in confusion. Her stomach began to ache from the stress she'd been under. But Madison didn't notice it. The only thought in her head was that her fiancé had betrayed her. "Why are you surprised?" With a cheeky grin, Chris continued to sneer. "A man like Richard needs a bright, spectacular, and beautiful woman like me, not someone like you." "What's wrong with me?" Madison asked quietly. "Well, let's just say you're too plain for Richard," Chris replied defiantly. "Let's start with your hair. It's a hairstyle that was worn 20 years ago. The color went out of fashion the year before last." The guest shook her head defiantly in defiance. "And your clothes are horrible. How can you dislike yourself so much as to stoop to such a thing?" Richard never said anything like that. He's always liked everything, the landlady mumbled confusedly. She suddenly realized that she felt a pain in her stomach. She should kick that girl out so Madison could lie down. Once she calms down, her stomach will stop hurting right away. Of course he won't tell you anything, Chris shrugged. You were the most convenient option for him. What are you talking about? Madison, don't be silly, she laughed. You're convenient. You feed the pigeon and put it to bed. What else does a man need to be happy? No, Madison suddenly shouted. You're all lying. Oh, honey, don't be silly. Chris said cynically. You must realize that a man like Richard will sooner or later get tired of living with a bland woman. He'll want exoticism and new emotions. So he switched to me. There was a spark between us as soon as we saw each other. But Richard, as an honest man, for 2 months could not respond to my feelings. But his love for me won out. Shut up, Madison. I know it's unpleasant to hear the truth, but as they say, it's better to know the truth than to live in ignorance. Get out. The pain twisted Madison. It felt like hot metal was being poured into her stomach. What's wrong with you? Chris realized something bad was happening to Madison. The landlady suddenly turned pale and sweat beaded on her face. Call an ambulance. What am I going to tell them? The guest asked in confusion. I'm pregnant. What? Chris looked at her rival in a daze. But Richard didn't tell me anything about the baby. He doesn't know anything yet, Madison said quietly. She slid down the wall and lay on the floor. She couldn't take the pain any longer. An ambulance. I can't lose the baby. Maybe it's for the best? Chris asked thoughtfully. You'll lose the baby, and you and Richard won't have anything to do. What's going on here? Suddenly there was a loud male voice. Through the pain, Madison recognized the voice as Oswald's. I came to talk to her about Richard and me, Chris said. She was talking fast and rambling. Suddenly she felt sick because she was pregnant. Madison, you're pregnant? Oswald interjected. Call an ambulance. Madison asked with all her might and fainted. Madison woke up in the hospital. There was a metal IV stand with a needle inserted into her right arm. The medication was slowly dripping down the tube. Is there anyone here? The girl whispered. Oh, you've come to your senses. An elderly woman who was lying on the next bed came to life. She pressed the nurse call button. A couple of minutes later, a large middle-aged woman entered the room. Despite her fullness, her movements were quick and precise. Tell me, what's wrong with me? Madison asked. Shush, the nurse said with a smile. Tomorrow morning the doctor will come to see you. He will tell you everything. In the meantime, rest. The nurse examined Madison and left the room. After she left, her roommate came over and sat down on a chair next to her. My name is Mrs. Megan, the woman introduced herself. What's yours? Madison. What a rare name these days, the neighbor smiled. You scared the girls last night. Can you tell me if you know what's wrong with my baby? Quietly asked the girl. What I don't know, Mrs. Megan waved her hand. They brought you in last night and put you here. It was awful to look at you. You were covered in IVs and wires. I see, Madison said. What a fiancé you have. The older woman smacked her tongue as she thought of Richard. Madison's heart clenched. In spite of everything, she loved that bastard. Why do you say that? The girl inquired. How was he here worried about you? You have no idea, Mrs. Megan shook her head. I was just seeing my son off when they brought you in by ambulance. Your husband wouldn't leave your side until the nurse chased him away. Otherwise, he'd have gone into surgery with you. The OR? Madison was dizzy from what she'd just heard. So there was something wrong with her baby if she was in surgery. Maybe that's why the nurse left the bad news to the doctor. And before I went to bed, I looked out of the window. Your fiancé was sitting on a bench, waiting for someone from the medical staff to come out and tell him what's wrong with you, the old woman continued to tell me without noticing the slim appearance of her new neighbor. Already close to night, he left. Can you imagine? Why was Richard here all this time? Doesn't he care about me? If he has another woman? Madison replied, confused. Yes. And he's been here since this morning, the older woman continued. Came to check on you. Are they allowed in here? No, but he talked the nurse into it, Mrs. Megan said in a confidential tone. So she let him in for 5 minutes. When he saw you, he fell to his knees in front of you. Forgive me, says Madison. Madison, you fool. If I'd known you were having a baby, I never would have done this. He said that. The girl was surprised. Word for word. Here's a cross for you. The old woman crossed herself. Yes, I believe you, Mrs. Megan. Madison smiled. What's next? He kneels down in front of you, kisses your hand, and cries and cries. And how can he not cry when he's guilty before you? Mrs. Megan wondered. Oswald may love you, but what has he done wrong if it's his fault you lost the baby? What did you say? Madison was stunned. How did I lose the baby? Oh, I'm just rambling on. I'm going for a walk. The older woman quickly got up from her chair and left the room. Mrs. Megan, wait, shouted the girl, but the neighbor didn't even stop. Tears sprang from Madison's eyes. Despite Richard's betrayal, she wanted this child. The girl had dreamed of a child since childhood. At first, she had asked her parents for a brother or sister, but they had stubbornly refused, citing financial difficulties. Madison knew that her parents were lying to her, because their income allowed to give birth and raise at least 2 or even 3 more children. Mom just didn't want to bother with nappies and cradles. She was more satisfied with a quiet life, where she could at any moment pack her things and go on holiday. And her father, who loved his wife madly, indulged her in everything and did not cross her. Then Madison firmly decided that she would have 3 children. And when she found out she was pregnant, she was overjoyed. And now her dream has come crashing down. Suddenly, Madison frowned. Why did Mrs. Megan call Oswald her fiancé? Now there were more questions than answers. The girl waited for her neighbor, but she persistently did not return. At that moment, a nurse came in. She deftly gave Madison an injection. All manipulations of the nurse were accompanied by silence. After a couple of minutes, the girl fell asleep. The next morning, when Madison opened her eyes, the elderly neighbor pretended not to notice the girl. Mrs. Megan, talk to me, please, the girl asked quietly. But the woman persisted in reading her book. A couple of minutes later, a doctor accompanied by a nurse entered the room. Hello, Madison. My name is Jonathan. I'm your doctor. How are you feeling? Doctor, what's wrong with my baby? Madison asked her question. Unfortunately, we couldn't save the fetus. The man shook his head. You were bleeding heavily and we had to save you. There was nothing we could do for your baby. Madison couldn't speak, the lump in her throat preventing her from doing so. Madison, I realize that what I'm going to say now will not calm you down. The doctor took the girl's hand. But you're still young. You'll definitely have children in the future. You just need to heal a little now, and everything will be fine. Promise? Madison asked hopefully. I promise, Jonathan answered. After the doctor left, Mrs. Megan sat down next to Madison. I didn't say those things out of spite, she said peacefully. It was just something I said without thinking. Mrs. Megan, you knew from the beginning that I'd lost the baby, didn't you? The girl said with resentment in her voice. And you gave me hope to think that it wasn't so bad. I'd been telling myself that I was going to be a mom. Forgive me, old fool. Tears appeared in the woman's eyes. I wanted to support you, but it didn't work out. You know, I know firsthand what it's like to lose a child. You do? Madison asked interestedly. Yes, after graduating from the Teacher Training Institute, I was sent to a town near Kansas. I felt the happiest because I was on my own. I was finally out of my mother's control. I came to the town, got a job at the school. It was a lot of work, but it didn't scare me. On the contrary, my enthusiasm was bursting. I spent all day at school, organizing the leisure time of the pupils in addition to lessons. Mrs. Megan stopped talking and turned away from the window. Madison was afraid to move so as not to disturb her neighbor's nostalgia. There was a steel mill next to the school. I once had to accompany my students on a field trip to the plant. We were met at the entrance hall by Charles, the honorary metallurgist, who knew the history of the plant like the back of his hand. He led us through the main shop where steel was cooked. The boys were shown the smelting process. You can't imagine the eyes my children looked at it with. Then we were introduced to the best brigade of the plant and its master, Alex. When I saw him, I immediately realized that I was missing. His smile drove me crazy. As it turned out later, our feelings were mutual. The old woman smiled at her memories. 6 months later, we got married. The whole town was celebrating our wedding. It seemed there was no happier couple in the whole world. We always did everything together. We cooked dinner together, cleaned, did the laundry. And when I realized I was pregnant, I thought I'd go crazy with happiness. One day my husband didn't meet me after school. At first I thought that he was delayed at work, so I went to the factory gate. The closer I got, the more anxious I became. There were people standing around the gatehouse. I could tell something was wrong. Mrs. Megan stood up, went to the bedside table and poured herself a glass of water. The woman's hands were shaking. It was obvious that it still hurt her to remember those events. She was rambling, but Madison understood her perfectly. As it turned out, there had been an explosion at the factory, and several people had been hurt. And Alex was killed, Mrs. Megan said. "Oh my God," Madison whispered in horror, pressing her palm to her mouth. When I got the news, I blacked out. I woke up in the hospital. That's when my roommate told me all about the explosion at the factory and the dead foreman. The most interesting thing is that she didn't even know that I was the wife of the foreman. You can't imagine the colors in which she described it all. And the cherry on the cake was my child, whom I lost. My neighbor told me about it as if her milk had gone sour in the fridge, in passing, by the way. How I screamed. I was sedated so much that it is impossible to imagine. After I was discharged from the hospital, I immediately wrote a letter of resignation. I packed my things and went back home to my mom. I couldn't live in this town where everything reminded me of my beloved husband and our unborn child. "Mrs. Megan, I'm sorry, I was wrong," Madison said guiltily. "I'm the one who should be apologizing to you," the neighbor said with a pleading tone in her voice. "I acted like that tactless old woman." "I'm so ashamed," Madison whispered. "It wasn't your fault at all. You just wanted what was best for me, so that I wouldn't have to go through the pain that you did." At that moment, a nurse came into the room. "Madison, how are you feeling?" she asked. "I'm fine." "Then go out into the lobby." "Why?" Madison was surprised. "Your fiancé is here to see you." Madison sighed heavily. She had made the decision to break up with Richard. Despite her love for him, she couldn't forgive his betrayal, which had resulted in the loss of her child. Madison slowly stood up and headed for the lobby. It was time to start a new life without lies and deceit. She walked slowly down the corridor, mentally reciting to herself what she had to say to Richard. The only thing that confused her was why her ex-fiancé had come to the hospital to apologize, or, on the contrary, to laugh at her for being such a fool. Going out into the lobby, the girl was dumbfounded. Oswald was standing in front of her. Seeing Madison, the man walked quickly towards her. "Madison, hello," Oswald said. "How are you? How are you feeling? What did the doctors say when you will be discharged?" "Stop," Madison said in an orderly tone. "Not so fast, I don't have time to answer all your questions. I'll start by asking you what you're doing here." "What do you mean?" The young man was taken aback. "I came to check on you. I also brought some fruit." Oswald handed Madison a transparent plastic bag containing oranges and apples. "Thank you," Madison thanked her guest quietly. Take, don't be shy," Oswald smiled. "It's my pleasure to take care of you. I know very well how they feed in hospitals. Besides, you need vitamins now." "That's true," the girl shrugged her shoulders. She nodded her head and pointed to a bench near the window. "Let's go and sit down." "Come on, tell me about it," the young man said, sitting down on the bench next to Madison. "I feel better now," Madison said quietly. "Unfortunately, I lost the baby." The girl was silent. She tried not to cry in front of Oswald. I know. Oswald lowered his head guiltily. It was my fault that it happened like that. Why? Madison jumped up. If I hadn't brought Richard into our firm, he wouldn't have met her, and my brother wouldn't have cheated on you. Oswald, don't blame yourself. Madison took his hand. It's not your fault. What is to be is not to be avoided. You see, if we're not meant to be with Richard, then so be it. Do you really think so? Oswald asked hopefully. Yes, I believe in signs of fate, Madison confirmed. So do not worry. Everything that is done, for the best. It's just a shame I lost the baby. I'm getting used to the idea that I'm going to be a mum soon. Don't worry, honey. The young man took the girl's hands in his. You will heal and rest a little now, and you will definitely have children in the future. I hope so, Madison smiled. Madison, my dear. I've wanted to tell you something for a long time. Oswald looked straight into the girl's eyes. You don't need Richard. A girl like you deserves more than that. Oswald, what are you talking about? Madison asked in a daze. My darling, my love. You deserve to be loved, carried in his arms, Oswald passionately whispered. I beg you, forget my foolish brother. Give me a chance to be near you. I love you very much. Oswald, are you crazy? Madison tried to pull her hands out of the iron grip of the guest, but he only squeezed them harder, not giving her the opportunity to get free. Suddenly the girl screamed. You're hurting me. Darling, I'm sorry, please. The young man, without letting go of her hands, began to kiss them. Oswald, let me go. But he, as if possessed by an invisible force, did not hear the girl's screams and continued to kiss her hands. Madison began to resist. She hit a bag of fruit that was lying nearby on a bench, causing apples and oranges to scatter on the lobby floor. What's going on here? Suddenly, a loud male voice was heard next to them, which sounded like a thunderclap in the silence. Oswald blushed in surprise and let go of Madison with a sudden movement. He looked at the tall, formidable man who had appeared as if out of thin air, eyes wide open. I came to check on Madison, Oswald said, stammering. I can see that Jonathan's eyes flashed with lightning. I can also see that the patient doesn't like it. So, young man, your appointment hours are over for today, Jonathan said in a tone that did not tolerate any objections. But Oswald tried to say something to the doctor, but he didn't let him. Should I call security? Jonathan asked icily. I'm leaving, Madison said through gritted teeth. He walked towards the exit, turned round at the door, and said goodbye to the girl. I'll come and see you tomorrow. Don't, Madison shouted, but Oswald didn't even turn round. Yes, Madison, what a fiancé you have. Madison's doctor shook his head in disapproval. Madison looked at Jonathan carefully. Who was he to judge her choice? Oswald is not my fiancé, Madison snapped at him. But this young man thinks otherwise, Jonathan said thoughtfully. I don't care what Oswald thinks. Madison walked past the doctor, heading for the room. He's just my ex-fiancé's cousin. Madison, are you forgetting something? Jonathan shouted after her. What, she asked, turning around. This. The doctor deftly picked up an orange from the floor and threw it to Madison. The girl orientated herself and caught the fruit. I don't need it, Madison smiled and tossed the orange back to Jonathan. No, that's no good, the man said in a jokingly menacing tone. He was about to throw the orange back, but the girl quickly walked over to him and took the fruit. My parents taught me not to throw food around. And you're throwing vitamins, by the way, she scolded the doctor. Madison walked over to the bench where the bag was lying, picked it up and began to pick up the fruit. Jonathan looked at her. Why are you looking at me? She said jokingly. Come on, help me. The man bent down and started picking oranges and apples. The two of them quickly picked up everything that was lying on the floor. When the last orange was left on the floor, Madison and Jonathan reached for it at the same time and their fingers touched. The young men jerked their hands sharply away from the fruit as if they had been electrocuted. Madison looked straight into her doctor's eyes. Suddenly she wanted to disappear into the green pool of Jonathan's eyes, but she quickly averted her gaze so as not to cause more trouble. Madison took the fruit and put it in the bag. "Thank you," she said in a quiet voice. "You're welcome," the man replied in a husky voice. "Now go back to your room. You need to rest." Jonathan turned round and went to his office. Madison stared after him for a long time. What just happened? It must be a surge of hormones after losing a child, she thought. She took the bag of fruit and went to her room. "Madison, what took you so long?" Mrs. Megan asked. "I'm waiting for you. I'm exhausted." "Why are you waiting for me?" Madison was surprised. Then she handed a bag of fruit to her neighbor. "Here's a treat for you. Would you like some company?" "Oh, thank you." The older woman smiled. "Why don't you eat it yourself? Your fiancé brought it for you." "You've got it mixed up. It's not my fiancé, it's his brother," the girl corrected her neighbor. "What brother?" Mrs. Megan was taken aback. "I heard him say he was your fiancé when they brought you in. And then he was on his knees in that room begging your forgiveness. Oswald apologized to me for getting Richard a job at the firm where he worked. That's where Richard had an affair with this Chris. Now Oswald blames himself for my losing the baby." "Wow," the woman grinned. "That's how life sometimes twists and turns." "Yeah," Madison agreed. At that moment, a nurse entered the room. "Madison, did you have a full house today?" The nurse said with a smile. "Go. Your fiancé is here to see you again." "What fiancé?" Mrs. Megan asked, squinting her eyes. "Why, do you have lots of them?" the nurse asked. "No, just one," Madison said. "And it was an ex." The girl didn't know what she should do. What if it's Oswald back? The last thing Madison wanted was to see him. What if Richard had a guilty conscience and decided to visit Madison? What's the point of guessing? We'll have to go out and see. Only Madison was a little apprehensive after the ugly scene Oswald had caused today. She didn't want to see him, much less talk to him. Taking a deep breath, Madison walked into the lobby. Richard was standing near the window, looking in. The girl grinned and felt a moment of déjà vu. Exactly an hour ago, she had walked out to Oswald, who was standing looking through that window. "Richard, what are you doing here?" the girl asked in a harsh tone. "What do you mean?" Richard was dumbfounded. He walked quickly to the girl and wanted to hug her, but Madison dodged his embrace. "Don't," Madison said firmly. "I asked you a question." "Madison, what's wrong with you?" The young man was taken aback. "I came to see you. I just got back from a business trip today. I was urgently sent on company business to another city. Oswald was supposed to tell you." "Richard, don't make excuses," the girl stood her ground. "I know the truth that Chris came to see me, and she told me everything." "Told you what?" Richard asked in surprise. "You're so good at acting," surprised Madison grinned. "I can't believe how good you are at acting." "Madison, can you explain to me in a human way what happened?" Richard asked demandingly. "Why did Chris come to see you?" "She told me the truth about you two being together and in love." "There must be some mistake." The young man furrowed his eyebrows. "Why is that?" Madison grinned. "Because she and Oswald have been dating for 2 months now and are in a serious relationship." Madison looked at Richard dumbfounded. She was completely confused as to whether Oswald was in a relationship with Chris. Then why had he confessed his love to her today? Madison looked at Richard carefully. "You're not confused about anything, are you?" she asked with a frown. "Madison, do you think I'm an idiot?" The young man was indignant. "The thing is that on Thursday, when I was in the hospital, Chris came to my house and told me that you were having an affair with her. She asked me to let you go to her." "That doesn't make any sense." Richard sat down on the bench. He looked at Madison carefully. "If you didn't know anything about me being in the hospital, how did you end up here?" Madison decided to find out the whole truth. "I came home and you were gone," the young man explained. "I called your phone, but you were off the hook." "Yes, because I blocked you," the girl confirmed. Why? Don't play dumb? Madison grinned. But you still haven't answered my question. The girl was determined to get to the truth. How did you know I was in the hospital? I came home, and our beloved neighbor Mrs. Cassandra told me in all the colors that you were taken away by ambulance. Do you understand? Okay, Madison said. Honey, tell me what happened to you, Richard asked. Nothing. Except that my fiancé is cheating on me, she blurted out. I lost the baby. Stop. The young man tried to realize the meaning of Madison's words. What baby? Ours. But why didn't you tell me you were pregnant before? I was going to tell you that Thursday when I went into the hospital, Madison grinned. Instead, I found out about your affair. How can you not realize that I'm not having an affair with this Chris? Richard raised his voice. Don't yell at me. Madison was indignant. Your brother, by the way, says otherwise, Madison said. He even apologized. That he introduced you to her. Oswald? The young man mumbled confusedly. But he's lying. I would never cheat on you. Why would he do that? Madison cut the young man's speech short. I don't know. Richard suddenly lost his temper. He walked over to Madison and grabbed her by the shoulders. Look, I'm not guilty of anything. I'm hurt. Madison tried to break free of the young man's iron grip. Let me go. Jonathan walked past the lobby at that moment. He took a quick step toward Richard and pulled him away from Madison. What kind of day is this? The doctor looked indignantly at his patient. Madison, is a hospital a place to get into a relationship? I'm sorry, the girl replied, lowering her head. She was embarrassed that Jonathan had witnessed such an ugly scene. It was the second time in one day. What would he think of her now? Young man, the man said in a firm tone, addressing Richard. I urge you to leave the hospital. Otherwise, I'll be forced to call security. But I've come to visit my fiancé. Ex-fiancé, Madison cut in. Especially ex-fiancé, Jonathan added. Any questions, please, after you've been discharged from the hospital. Your fiancé has lost a child. She needs to regain her strength both physically and mentally. Madison, get me off the blacklist, please, Richard asked. Why? So I can at least call you. Richard, there's no need for that, Madison said tiredly. She was exhausted from the fight with Oswald and Richard. Get your things and get out of my flat. I'm going to the hospital. I don't think we need to hurry, Richard said. I'll wait for you and we'll talk about it. You see, I've already made up my mind, and talking about it isn't going to change anything, Madison said. And you're just delaying the inevitable. I'll wait for you, Richard said. He wanted to kiss Madison goodbye, but she wouldn't let him. I'll wait for you at home, the young man said and left. Jonathan looked at the girl. What kind of strange suitors do you have? The doctor grinned. I'm shocked. Madison walked slowly into the room. She wanted to lie in bed and cover herself so she wouldn't have to see anyone or anything else today. Madison silently walked into the room and got into bed. Mrs. Megan, try as she might, could not get her neighbor to talk. The older woman took great offense at Madison for not saying anything to her. How was the meeting with the next fiancé, thought. But the girl didn't care about her neighbor's feelings. She would have to sort out her own. The girl could not sleep for a long time. She couldn't understand which of the two brothers was lying to her, which of them was pursuing his own advantage, and most importantly, what kind. Madison decided to make a confrontation for all three: Richard, Oswald, and Chris. That this girl has a relationship with one of the brothers, there is no doubt. Just whose side is she playing on? It remains to think of such a situation to catch all three together by surprise. The only place where all the conditions match perfectly is the firm where all three work. All the following days, Madison carefully avoided meeting her brothers, although they regularly came to visit the girl. The last thing she wanted to do was talk to them. Madison realized that her love for Richard was just an obsession. At first, she didn't like his advances. Then she dreamed of his future fame as a famous computer programmer. And then the girl felt sorry for the unrecognized genius, because he had worked so hard to write this super program. And when the truth came out that the program was a figment of Richard's dreams, she felt offended that she had been tricked for so long. As they say, everything is for the best, Madison thought. She spent all her free time at the hospital with Jonathan. At first, the attending physician seemed like a serious man who was only interested in medicine. In fact, Jonathan, as he asked to be called, was only 10 years older than her. His range of interests was so broad that Madison couldn't imagine how she could know so much. They spent days and evenings talking, and each time the subject was different. During this time, she learned a lot of new and useful information. And at the same time, Jonathan was not a connoisseur and did not try to be clever. Unlike her ex-fiancé, who at every opportunity let Madison know that she was stupid. The day of the discharge came. Madison couldn't hide her disappointment. "This is it," she sighed sadly as she walked into her doctor's office. "Why are you sighing so sadly?" Jonathan smiled. "I am being discharged today, and it's time to break up." Madison shrugged. "You sound like you're going to another planet." "Madison, why are you so sad?" The man came up to the girl and put his arm around her. "Are you saying that our relationship is over? Can't we continue it outside the hospital?" "Is that what you want?" Madison asked hopefully. "I do," Jonathan answered. "As soon as I saw you, I knew we had to be together." "You do?" The girl's eyes lit up with happiness. Really, Jonathan kissed her cheek, which made Madison blush. She was pleased with the man's advances. "There was one thing I didn't like." "What's that?" Madison frowned. Their relationship hadn't even begun yet, and already there were complaints. "Madison, please deal with your brothers. I don't want them around you all the time. Plus, I'm confessing my love for you." "Don't worry about that," she exhaled. "I have an idea how to get them out." "Which one do you think is lying?" "I don't know," Madison admitted honestly. "What if Richard is telling the truth? And he hasn't cheated on you?" Jonathan asked with concern in his voice. "Would you go back to him?" "No," Madison answered. "The situation had made it clear to me that I hadn't loved Richard for a long time. It was clear to me that I had treated him like a little child." "Why?" Jonathan wondered. "I felt sorry for him, and I treated him like a piece of paper. He sat on my neck for so long and manipulated me. And I was stupid enough to let him do it because I felt sorry for him. How can it be that Richard works so hard, and his program still doesn't appeal to his customers? As it turned out, it was his idea, and no one ever wanted his software." I see Jonathan pulled her tighter against him. "What are your plans for today?" "I want to get all my stuff home first. Take a shower." Madison rested her head on Jonathan's shoulder. "And then I want to go to that firm where all three of them work." "Why?" "Why?" She grinned. "I want to catch them in an uncomfortable situation. That way I'll get them out in the open quicker." "I won't let you go there alone." Jonathan was determined. "I'm coming with you. I'm just finishing my workday for the day." "Great." Madison kissed the man. "You'll be a great support. I'm going to go pack. I'll be waiting for you downstairs in the car." Jonathan smiled at her. He was glad he had met her. He was glad that he had met her. It so happened that all the girls he had relationships with did not understand his attitude towards work. After all, Jonathan gave himself to it completely, and the girls were capricious, forcing him to choose between work and them. Jonathan had always chosen work, as it was the only thing he saw the meaning of his life in. It was only now, when Madison came along, that he realized what it was to love and be with this girl all the more. Madison understood him and accepted him for who he was, and now he would do anything to make this fragile girl happy. Walking out of the hospital into the street, Madison breathed a full sigh. How she had missed fresh air all this time. "Madison, don't stay out in the cool air too long, or you'll catch a cold," Jonathan shouted. He was standing outside his car waiting for the girl. When he saw Madison, the man opened the car door for her. "Please, my princess, the carriage is here," he said. "Thank you, my king." Madison smiled back. She was pleased with Jonathan's advances, unlike Richard, who never even gave her a hand when she got off the bus. The gallant Jonathan's manners were on point. "Where are we going?" the man asked as he got into the car. "Home first," Madison replied happily. "I want to take a quick shower to wash off all the hospital odors. No hard feelings, okay? Even though I love my job so much, every time I come home from the hospital I shower and wash my clothes too. I feel like I smell sick." "Then go home now," Jonathan commanded. When they entered their flat, the girl's mood had dropped considerably. It was obvious that Richard had never moved out. She picked up her former young man's traveling bag and quickly threw Richard's things into it. "Well, that's it, I guess," said a satisfied Madison as she walked around the flat and looked around. She didn't want any little thing to remind her of their former relationship. "Jonathan, I'm going to take a shower. Could you put the kettle on? I'm dying for a sip of green tea." "As you say, my princess," the man kissed the girl on the cheek and went to the kitchen. An hour later, the young people headed to the firm where the brothers worked. The girl just couldn't wait to look them both in the eyes, as well as to set things straight. When Madison and Jonathan entered the office where the brothers worked, they saw Oswald kissing Chris. "What an interesting picture." Madison grinned. "And you, girl, I see that you are not bad. You're having an affair with two brothers at once." "Madison, what are you doing here?" Oswald was confused. Then he looked at Jonathan, and he was instantly angry. "And your protector is here." "We've come to set things straight," Jonathan said, explaining his presence. "Where's Richard?" Madison asked. "I don't think we can find out the truth without him." "I'm here." Richard walked into the office. "I was on a call." "Madison, hi. You've been discharged?" "Yeah, today." Madison held out a bag of her ex-fiance's stuff. "Here, this is yours." "Did you decide to break up with me after all?" Richard sighed sadly. "Yes, I realized that you and I are too different, so you and I are no longer on the same path." "That's a shame." "You're a fool, brother." Oswald grinned wryly. "If I were you, I wouldn't let Madison go. I'd fight for her." "What's the point?" Richard asked indifferently. "Believe me, I know that look in Madison's eyes. She's not in love with me anymore." "Wait, are you saying Madison is with that right now?" Oswald pointed his head at Jonathan. "Choose your words, young man," Jonathan warned in a cautionary tone. "Or what?" Oswald asked defiantly. "All right, everybody calm down." Madison looked angrily at those present. "Oswald, I want to thank you." "For what?" Stupefied young man. "If it hadn't been for your adventure, I would never have met Jonathan." The girl's eyes lit up with happiness. "I would have lived on hopes and promises of a better life." "Madison, I can give you an even better one." Oswald began. But he was interrupted by Chris, who screamed hysterically. "Honey, what's all this?" The girl stomped her foot. "First you swore to me in love, saying that you want to marry. And then you actually did?" "Jesus, Chris, look at yourself," Oswald grinned. "I just needed you to come to Madison and introduce yourself as Richard's fiancée. That's all I needed." "You used me?" Chris squealed. "Do you think it's possible to have a serious relationship with someone like you?" Oswald grinned. "You are only for fun and nothing more. Not like Madison." "How is she better than me?" Chris looked at her rival with dislike. "Everything," Oswald replied. "Look at you and her. It is because of women like Madison committed feats." "Enough," Madison ordered. "I'm not interested in your relations," came out the boss and turned to those present. "Oswald, I never want you in my life again." "If it weren't for your pregnancy, I would have succeeded," Oswald said angrily. "The only thing that would have worked out for you is that Richard and I would have split up," Madison said firmly. "But I would never have been with you, that's for sure. I hope that was the last time we see each other. That goes for the three of you." "Shall we go?" Jonathan asked. He put his arm around Madison's shoulders. "Let's go," she smiled at her lover. Suddenly her gaze fell on Richard, who stood like a child abandoned by his mother. He lowered his head and did not know what he should do next. For a moment she felt sorry for her former fiancé, but the girl quickly pulled herself together. After all, Richard was a man who had to become independent. Madison and Jonathan left the office. The girl breathed a sigh of relief. God, I can breathe easy. Madison smiled. Then she kissed Jonathan on the cheek. Where are we going? Let's go to the park and walk, she suggested. That's a great idea. Madison took Jonathan's hand. She was happy to have met him. She saw in him all the qualities of a man she had always dreamed of. In the short time they had known each other, Jonathan had proved himself to be responsible, honest, and wise. He had become a friend to Madison, someone she could confide in. This man would not hesitate to lean on her shoulder in times of need, and he was the only one she was willing to share the family's troubles with.